The stagecoach hit the rut so hard that the rear axle shrieked like something alive, and Evelyn Mercer, already pressed against the far corner of the carriage with her knees drawn up and her face turned toward the window, felt the whole world tilt sideways in one lurching second. She grabbed for the leather strap above the door. Got it. Lost it. Then the door blew open. The latch had been weak since Colton, she'd noticed it, told herself it didn't matter. And the momentum of the coach and the angle of the road and the simple, stupid physics of a body with nothing to hold on to conspired against her all at once. She didn't scream. That surprised her later, when she had time to think about it. She'd spent so many years learning not to make noise that even falling from a moving stagecoach couldn't undo the training. The ground came up fast. She hit shoulder first, then hip, then the side of her face scraped something. Gravel, maybe? Or the hard pan of desert crust. And she rolled twice before she stopped. Dust mushroomed around her. The stagecoach kept going. She could hear it. The wheels, the shouts of the driver trying to slow the team, the groan of wood and iron. And then those sounds faded, and what she heard instead was wind. Just wind, flat and dry and completely indifferent. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory. Her shoulder screamed when she moved it. Her left cheek was wet. Blood, she knew the feeling well enough by now. And her ribs complained with every breath in a way that wasn't new exactly, but wasn't good either. The dress she wore, gray cotton, plain by necessity, 2 sizes too large because she'd been thinner when it was bought, was torn at the sleeve and filthy at the hem. She sat up. The settlement was maybe a quarter-mile ahead. She could see the outline of it. Low wooden buildings, a water tower, the kind of architecture that said temporary even when the people had been there 20 years. A single road cut through the middle, wide enough for wagons, beaten flat by hooves and wheels and weather. The stagecoach had stopped at the far end of it. She could see the driver looking back at her. He didn't climb down. She got to her feet. It took 2 attempts. Well, the town was called Harlan's Crossing, though nobody she'd ask in the next several days could tell her who Harlan was or what exactly he'd crossed. The name had just stuck the way names do in small places, by repetition rather than meaning. It had a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house on the upper floor, a barber shop, a telegraph office that worked about half the time, and a doctor whose actual training was a subject of some private debate among the locals. There was also a church that hadn't held a regular service in 4 months because the preacher had ridden out in February and not come back, and a small jailhouse that currently held only a stray dog someone had locked in there as a joke, and then forgotten. Evelyn walked the quarter-mile with her bad shoulder pulled tight against her body, and her jaw set. She was aware of the picture she made. She'd been aware of the picture she made for a long time. A woman alone, a woman marked up. A woman with no luggage and no man walking beside her was a woman that certain people read as opportunity. She'd learned to spot those people quickly. The first one she clocked was leaning against the post outside the saloon. He had the look of a man who spent most of his time watching things instead of doing them. Mid-40s, thick through the middle, hat pushed back on a wide forehead. He tracked her the whole way up the road. Didn't say anything yet, just watched. The second was the stagecoach driver himself, who had finally descended from his box and was seen to the horses with one eye on her. "You all right?" he called when she got close enough. "Fine," she said. "Door latch has been—" "I noticed." He had the grace to look away. She needed water. She needed to clean the cut on her face before it stiffened and got infected. She needed to figure out whether she had enough coin left in the hem of her dress. She'd sewn it there herself 18 months ago, hoarding quarters and dimes and once a whole dollar that she'd hidden in the spine of a book to pay for a meal and maybe one night indoors. She had $11.30. She'd counted it so many times she didn't need to count it again. The general store was the safest bet. She pushed the door open. The man behind the counter was older, thin-faced, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful expression of someone who'd seen enough that very little surprised him anymore. He looked at her, the cut, the torn sleeve, the general state of her, and said nothing immediately, which she appreciated. "I need clean water," she said, "and something for a cut. Carbolic, if you have it." "Got carbolic." He turned and started looking through his shelves. "Stage accident? Door latch." He set a brown bottle on the counter. "That's 15 cents. I'll take it." She also bought a small cloth, 5 cents, and used the basin he kept by the back wall to clean her face with water he pumped from a hand pump in the corner. The cut on her cheek was shallow, looked worse than it was. She'd had far worse. She was pressing the carbolic dampened cloth against her face when the door opened behind her and the man from the post outside came in. She didn't turn around. She watched him in the warped tin that served as a kind of distorted mirror on the shelf in front of her. "Looks like you had a rough ride," he said. Addressed to her back. Easy voice, practiced. "Stage door," she said. Same thing she'd told the storekeeper. "Where you headed?" "Passing through?" "Passing through to where?" He was moving around the store, picking things up, setting them down. Not shopping, just moving. "That's my business." "Friendly question." "I gave you a friendly answer." The storekeeper had gone very still behind his counter. Evelyn noted that. The man from the post stepped closer. She could smell him. Tobacco, sweat, something else she didn't want to name. "Woman alone out here. No bags, cut up. That's not passing through, that's running." She turned around then, looked at him directly. She'd learned to do that. To not look away first. Because men like this read a dropped gaze as an invitation to keep pushing. "Sir," she said, voice level, "I'm not running from anything. I fell out of a stagecoach. I bought some carbolic. I'm going to finish cleaning my face, and then I'm going to be on my way. Is there something you actually need from this store?" He blinked. A small hesitation, then a slow smile that was mostly teeth. No need to be sharp about it. "I wasn't being sharp." She turned back to the basin. "I was being direct." He stayed another minute, then left. The door swung shut behind him. The storekeeper let out a long breath. "That's Wade Gurney," he said. He seemed to consider how much to say. "Just keep moving if he comes around again." "I intend to," Evelyn said. But she'd been sitting on a bench outside for maybe 20 minutes, trying to figure out what came next. There was no stage going out until Thursday, which was 4 days away, and she had no real destination to begin with, just the concept of away, when the wagon came in from the North Road. It was nothing special to look at. A flatbed work wagon with weathered wood slats and a team of 2 horses that had seen better decades. The man driving it sat with the kind of loose, unconscious ease that said he'd been handling horses since before he could remember. He was maybe early 40s, hard to say exactly, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least a week. He wore a work coat despite the heat, canvas, and worn at the elbows, and he kept his eyes forward as he came up the main road. He would have driven straight past her, except that Wade Gurney chose that moment to come back around from the side alley. And when Gurney saw Evelyn still on the bench, he changed direction and headed toward her with that same easy, predatory pace he'd used in the store. "Thought you were on your way," Gurney said. "Thought you were done with your question," she said. He sat down on the bench beside her without being asked. Too close. She shifted away. He shifted with her. "See, here's the thing about Harlan's Crossing," he said, like he was explaining something reasonable. "Women alone don't last long out here without someone to... Take your hand off my arm." He'd put it there so smoothly she'd almost missed it. His fingers were around her forearm just above the wrist. "Easy now. Get your hand off her." The wagon had stopped. The man from the wagon, the one with the gray temples, was standing about 8 feet away. He hadn't come running, hadn't raised his voice particularly, but there was something in the way he'd said it that made Gurney's grip loosen. "Thorne," Gurney said, "this isn't your concern. It became my concern when you put your hand on her." Caleb Thorne, if that's what Gurney had called him, didn't move any closer. Just stood there. He had his thumbs hooked in his belt and the look of someone who had decided something and wasn't planning to undecide it. "Let go." There was a beat. Gurney weighed something, then he let go of Evelyn's arm and stood, brushing at his coat like the whole thing had been his idea. "Just being neighborly," Gurney said. "Sure you were," Thorne said. Gurney walked away. He didn't hurry, but he walked. Evelyn looked at the man who'd stopped his wagon. He was looking at Gurney's retreating back, not at her, and she had the distinct impression he was checking to make sure Gurney actually kept going. "Thank you," she said. He glanced at her then, took in the cut, the torn sleeve, the general situation, looked away again. "You got somewhere to be?" "Eventually." What's that mean? It means I'm working on it. He was quiet for a moment. She could tell he was calculating something, though what exactly she couldn't say. He didn't look particularly charitable. He didn't look like a man who made a habit of helping strangers. He looked tired mostly, and a little irritated with himself, like he'd already made a decision he hadn't planned on making. I run a ranch, he said, 7 miles north. I need someone to cook and keep house. He said it flatly, like a business proposition. No warmth in it. Board and meals included. Small wage. Evelyn looked at him. You don't know anything about me. No. I don't know anything about you. That's true. You could be worse than him. She nodded in the direction Gurney had gone. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a wince. More like something that had been pushed on. I could be, he said. I'm not. But I can't prove that to you standing here, and I'm not going to try. He turned back toward his wagon. Stage doesn't run again until Thursday. Harlan's Crossing doesn't have a women's lodging. The saloon costs $2 a night, and Gurney's got 2 friends. He climbed up onto the wagon seat, picked up the reins. Up to you. She sat there for a moment. She thought about the $11.30 in her hem. She thought about the 4 days until Thursday. She thought about Gurney's hand on her arm and the storekeeper going still and the 2 friends Caleb Thorne had mentioned. She stood up and walked to the wagon. I'll need to know the terms, she said, specifically. Room of your own, 3 meals if you cook them, $1 a week, nothing else required or expected. And if I decide to leave, then you leave. He said it simply. I'm not in the business of keeping people who want to go. She studied his face for another moment. He met her eyes without flinching and without whatever it was that men like Gurney put into their eyes when they looked at her. Just level. Waiting. She climbed up onto the wagon. Oh, the road north was not a road so much as a suggestion. 2 wheel ruts worn into the scrubland, threading between mesquite and creosote and the occasional stand of cottonwoods wherever water ran close enough to the surface. The land was flat here, and then abruptly not. The terrain broke and buckled into shallow draws and ridges without much warning, and Caleb Thorne navigated it the way someone navigates a room they've crossed in the dark 1,000 times, without thinking. He didn't talk much. She didn't push him to. After about a mile, she said, Evelyn Mercer? He glanced over. Caleb Thorne. I know. Gurney said it. He looked back at the road. The horses knew where they were going, she suspected. They barely needed guidance. How long have you had the ranch? She asked. 8 years? Alone? A pause. Mostly. She accepted that and didn't push. The land grew rougher and then opened up again, and the ranch came into view around a bend of low hills. A main house, solidly built, nothing fancy, with a covered porch that ran the length of the front. A barn off to the left, newer than the house by the look of the wood. A series of smaller outbuildings. A smokehouse, a tool shed, a pump house, arrayed around a central yard that was swept dirt, practical, without adornment. A garden plot on the south side, mostly gone to weeds except for a stubborn row of what might be beans. No flowers, nothing planted for prettiness. This was a working place. There were 4 horses in the near pasture and a 5th at the barn. She spotted 2 ranch hands, young men, teenagers almost, moving around the barn, and they stopped what they were doing to stare at the wagon as it came in. Jose and Danny, Thorne said. Brothers, they work the stock. They live here? Jose does. Danny rides in from his family's place. She nodded. The wagon stopped at the porch. Thorne climbed down and tied off the horses with quick, efficient movements. He came around and looked up at her. She hadn't moved yet, with that same level, waiting expression. I can get down myself, she said. I didn't say you couldn't. She got down. Her shoulder protested sharply, and she pressed her lips together and rode it out. And he didn't comment on that either, which she appreciated. He showed her the house. It was clean. Not comfortable exactly, but clean. Swept floors, nothing left to clutter that didn't have a use. A kitchen that someone had organized with genuine care for function. A wood stove, a good one, with cast iron that had been properly maintained. Shelves with dry goods. A pump at the kitchen sink that actually worked when she tested it. The room he showed her was at the back of the house, past the kitchen. Small, with a single window that looked out toward the garden. A cot with a real mattress, not straw-filled, real, and a wool blanket folded at the foot, a peg on the wall and a washstand with a basin and pitcher. It had a door with a latch. She looked at the latch for a moment. "I can put a bolt on the inside," he said. "If you want." She turned around. "Yes, please." He nodded and left. She heard him moving around in the barn, and about an hour later he came in with an iron bolt and a small chisel and installed it himself, while she sat on the cot and watched him work. He did it carefully, testing the fit twice before he was satisfied. "That'll hold," he said. "Thank you." He stood, awkward in the small room, suddenly not threatening, just aware of himself in someone else's space. He moved toward the door. "Supper's usually around 6, he said. "Whatever you find in the kitchen. There's dried beef, beans, cornmeal. Jose brings eggs when he has them." "I can work with that." He nodded, stepped out. She heard his boots on the floorboards, heading back toward the front of the house, and then the creak of the porch, and then quiet. She sat in the small room with the bolted door and the window that looked out toward a weedy garden, and listened to the wind, and she thought, this is not safe. But it might be safer. That was a distinction she'd learned to care about. The difference between not safe and safer was a distinction that had kept her alive. The first 3 days passed in a kind of cautious routine. She cooked, found out quickly enough what was in the kitchen and what shape it was in and what a practical supper could look like when you were feeding 3 people on ranch basics. She made beans with dried beef the first night and cornbread and black coffee and set it on the table at 6 o'clock. Caleb Thorne came in, washed his hands at the kitchen pump, sat down, and ate without complaining. "Good," he said when he was done. That was all. She found that good enough. Danny went home each evening after supper. Jose ate at the barn mostly. By preference she gathered. She left a plate covered with cloth on the fence post for him, and it was always gone by morning. She didn't push him to the table. On the second day she found the weeded garden and without asking started pulling the worst of it out. Her shoulder made digging painful, so she worked slowly, methodically, getting the worst of the intruding growth away from what was trying to grow despite being abandoned. The bean row she'd spotted was genuinely alive. There were also carrots buried under 6 inches of unwanted company that proved they hadn't given up. Caleb came around the corner of the house that afternoon and stopped when he saw her. "Didn't ask you to do that," he said. "I know." She kept working. "I need to do something with my hands." He stood there for a moment. "There's a hat on the porch if the sun's a problem." She looked up. He was already walking toward the barn. She got the hat. It was a man's hat, old, gone soft with use. It fit well enough. On the third day, she was scrubbing the kitchen floor. It needed it. Layers of dust and tracked-in dirt that no amount of dry sweeping fixed. When she found the photograph, it had fallen behind the wood stove, or been pushed there, or slid there by vibration over time. A small photograph, the old kind, brownish and formal. A woman, sitting very straight, with her hair done up in the style of maybe 10 years ago. Not pretty in any conventional way. Strong-jawed, clear-eyed, with the kind of face that suggested she knew what she thought about things. On the back, in small, careful writing, Clara, 1878. Evelyn held it for a moment. Then she set it on the kitchen table, face up. When Caleb came in for supper that evening and saw it, he went very still. "Found it behind the stove," Evelyn said. "Thought you'd want it." He picked it up, set it face down on the table. Sorry," she said. She turned back to the stove. "Don't be." His voice was level, but not quite flat. It should have been somewhere else." He took the photograph and left the kitchen, and she heard a drawer open somewhere in the front of the house and then close. He didn't say anything about it at supper. She didn't ask, but she thought about the strong jaw in the photograph and the careful handwriting and the fact that there were no other photographs anywhere in this house. No needlework on the walls, no decorative touches of any kind, just the ghost of organization, the shelves, the kitchen layout, certain small choices that said someone who knew what they were doing had once set this place up with genuine thought, and then wasn't here anymore. On the 4th day, Wade Gurney came out to the ranch. He came with one other man, stocky, red-faced, with a shotgun resting across his lap in the wagon they drove up in. which was, Evelyn thought, a very specific kind of message. She was at the well in the yard when they pulled up, and she stood and watched them come, feeling the cold, familiar calculation settle into her chest. How far to the porch? How far to the house? Where was Caleb? Where were the boys? Caleb came around from the barn before she could do anything. He must have heard the wagon. "Gurney?" he said. Flat. "Thorn." Gurney looked at Evelyn with that slow smile. "Heard you picked up a stray." "She works here. That what you rode out to check on?" "Just being neighborly." He always said that, she'd noticed. Neighborly, like it was a shield. "Thought I'd ride out, pay a call." "You've paid it." Caleb's hands were loose at his sides. "Anything else?" Gurney looked at Evelyn again, longer this time. She met his gaze and didn't drop it. "Woman like that," Gurney said conversationally, "running from something. Somebody's looking for her, probably. Could cause you problems, Thorn. Association." "My association and my problem," Caleb said. "You have a good ride back." There was that beat again, the same one she'd seen in the general store, where Gurney was weighing something. The man with the shotgun shifted in the wagon seat. "You're making a mistake," Gurney said. "Done that before," Caleb said. Still standing, Gurney held for another moment, then clicked his tongue at his horse and turned the wagon around. Evelyn watched them go. When they were far enough down the road, she let out a long, controlled breath. "You made an enemy there," she said. "Had him before." Caleb turned and went back toward the barn. "He's land greedy. It's not about you." "Not really." He stopped, looked back at her. "Though if you know of a reason someone might be looking for you, I'd like to hear it." She met his eyes. "My husband," she said. "I left him 4 months ago." He's the kind of man who doesn't accept that. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What's his name?" "Emmett Mercer. He's out of Beaufort County, east side. I've been moving west." "You think he'll come this far?" "I think he will eventually. He has money and he has the kind of pride that doesn't let things go." She said it factually, without drama. "I'm telling you now because you gave me a choice when you didn't have to, and it didn't seem right to let you keep not knowing." He nodded slowly. "All right. If you want me to leave..." "I didn't say that." He turned back toward the barn. "Supper at 6. That night, after she'd cleaned up and bolted her door, Evelyn lay on the cot in the dark and cataloged what she knew. She knew this ranch was a place where something had ended badly. She knew the woman in the photograph, Clara, had been real and had been important and was gone in a way that had something to do with the silences Caleb Thorne carried around with him, the way some men carry tools on their belt. Not a weight exactly, but something he'd grown so used to it had become part of his posture. She knew Gurney wanted something. Land, probably. Caleb had said land greedy, and that she had given him a convenient excuse to come sniffing around, and that excuse would probably be useful to him in ways she couldn't entirely predict yet. She knew Emmett was looking. She had known that since the first hour she'd left. She'd been lucky so far. 4 months of moving, never staying long enough, taking irregular routes. But luck ran out. It always ran out. She knew she had $11.20 left. She'd spent 10 cents on coffee at the general store the first morning because she hadn't been thinking clearly, and a room with a bolt on the door and a week's wages coming if she stayed. She thought about Clara's handwriting. Careful. The word that had come to mind when she'd seen it. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the scrubland in long, whispering sweeps, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out and got no answer. This was what the frontier sounded like at night, she thought, like a question with no one around to answer it. She'd asked plenty of those herself. She'd learned to get used to the silence. Bassett. A week passed, and then a week and a half. She settled into the work without deciding to. The garden gave her something particular, something that pushed back, that rewarded attention, that was alive in a way that cleaning floors and cooking beans was not. She cleared the rest of the unwanted growth from around the carrot row and found more than she'd expected. She started a new bed for late-season planting in the cleared space beside it, figuring the soil needed turning anyway. Her shoulder improved. The cut on her face healed into a thin line she'd probably carry permanently, along with the others. She learned the shape of Caleb's silences. There were different kinds. There was the silence of someone who had nothing to say, and the silence of someone who had things they weren't saying, and the silence of someone who had said everything they meant to say and was done. He moved between them fluidly. She'd been around enough people by now to read the difference. He was competent in the way that people who've been relying on themselves for a long time become competent. Not showy, not with any apparent pride in it, just doing the work because it needed doing and doing it correctly because there was no point in doing it wrong. She watched the way he moved around the horses. He had a particular way with the big gray mare in the north pastures, slower, more patient than with the others. The mare had a bad leg, old injury, and Caleb checked it every morning without being asked by anyone. "She one of the originals?" Evelyn asked him one afternoon, leaning on the pasture fence. He glanced up. "One of the first 4 I bought, 13 years. He ran a hand along the mare's neck. "She's slowing down. But you keep her. She's not a piece of equipment." He said it simply, not defensively, just as a fact. Evelyn nodded. There was something in that she filed away, that helped her understand the shape of him better. She also learned, slowly, that Clara had died on this property. Not from illness, and not from accident. She didn't know more than that yet. She'd heard it in fragments, overheard from a conversation Jose had with a passing rancher who'd stopped to buy feed, a conversation that dropped to a murmur when she came too close and then stopped entirely. What happened out at Thorne's place? That was all she caught. What happened out at Thorne's place? She didn't ask Caleb directly. She had her own unwanted history and she understood how it sat on a person. And she understood that asking someone to open a box they'd decided to keep closed was an imposition she had no right to make. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she noticed things. She noticed that he never went into the small building behind the barn. It was locked, but more than locked. The padlock was new and expensive, a deliberate choice, and the rest of the building was well maintained from the outside. Kept, not abandoned. She noticed that he received a letter at the end of her first week. The writer from town who brought it handed it over and was gone quick, and Caleb stood on the porch reading it twice, and when he looked up, his expression had gone somewhere quiet and unreachable. He put the letter in his coat pocket and didn't mention it. She noticed that Danny and Jose treated him with something that looked like loyalty, but moved like deference, the way younger people do around someone who has absorbed something terrible and kept going, and whose steadiness has become a reference point. She thought, whatever happened here, it was bad enough to change the gravity of the place. She thought, and I walked into the middle of it with $11 and a torn sleeve. What? On a Thursday evening, near the end of her second week, she was sitting on the porch when Caleb came and sat in the other chair. There were 2, facing out toward the north, and she'd never seen him use the second one, and they were quiet together for a while, watching the sky go through its colors. "You're better with the horses than you let on," he said after a while. "I grew up on a farm." He was quiet again. "You plan to stay through winter?" She looked at him. "I don't know, I hadn't planned much past getting far enough." He nodded like that made sense. "You can stay through winter if you want. Work steady." "I appreciate that." More quiet. The colors in the sky shifted from orange to deep rose to a bruised purple along the horizon. "The letter you got," she said carefully. "Is it something I should know about?" He didn't answer right away. She thought he was going to leave it unanswered. "Federal Marshal's office," he said finally, "out of the territory seat. They're reopening an inquiry." He stopped. "Into a death. From 3 years ago." She waited. "My wife," he said. "Clara." She kept her voice level. "I'm sorry." "She was shot," he said. It came out flat, the flatness of a thing said so many times in the mind it had worn smooth. "On this property. The man who did it, he was powerful enough that what happened got written down as accident and closed inside of 6 months. I've known for 3 years that it was wrong. And now someone's reopening it. Federal level, something changed." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know yet what." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The dark shapes of the hills against the last light. The horses moving in the pasture, unhurried. "The locked building behind the barn," she said. He looked at her. "That's Clara's studio. She worked in tin. Decorative work, functional pieces, both." A pause. "I couldn't get rid of it." Couldn't go in it either. That makes sense, she said. It doesn't bother you? The weight of it all. She looked at him. Mr. Thorne, she said, I have my own weight. I'm not about to judge someone else's. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back out at the valley, and something in his jaw that had been tight all evening loosened just slightly. Caleb, he said. What? You don't need to say Mr. Thorne. All right, she said. Caleb. The last light left the sky. Out in the scrubland, the coyotes started their conversation, calling back and forth in the dark, as if they had a great deal to settle before morning. Inside the house, someone had left a lamp burning in the kitchen window. She hadn't left it, which meant he had. She didn't say anything about that. She just noted it, and when she went inside a little later, she turned the wick down carefully so it wouldn't burn through the night, and latched the kitchen door, and went to her room and bolted it from the inside, and lay on her cot in the dark with the sound of the frontier outside the window, and thought about a woman named Clara who had made careful things with tin and had been killed on this property by a man with enough power to call it an accident, and thought about Emmett Mercer, who was somewhere east of her, looking, and thought about the letter from the federal marshal's office, and the inquiry being reopened, and what that might mean for a man who had been carrying a locked building in his yard for 3 years. She thought about all of it for a long time, and when she finally stopped thinking, what replaced the thoughts was something that felt like it might be the very beginning of purpose. A direction, maybe. However unclear. She'd take that. She'd take that over nothing. Outside, the wind spoke its long, unintelligible language across the scrubland, and the stars did whatever stars do when no one is looking, and Harlan's Crossing sat 7 miles south in the dark, and the road between here and there was just 2 ruts in the earth that the grass was always trying to reclaim. She was here. She had made it here, at least. That would have to be enough for tonight. The federal marshal's letter sat in Caleb's coat pocket for 3 days before he did anything with it. Evelyn knew because she could see the way it weighted him. Not visibly, not in any way he'd ever admit to, but in small things. The way he stood at the kitchen pump in the mornings a few seconds longer than necessary, water running over his hands while he looked at nothing in particular. The way he'd start to say something at supper, and then not say it, redirecting himself to a question about the garden or the horses, or whether she'd noticed the south fence needed restringing. She noticed. She didn't push. On the 4th morning after the letter arrived, she came in from the garden to find him sitting at the kitchen table with the letter open in front of him and a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. He didn't look up when she came in. She went to the stove, poured herself coffee, and sat down across from him. Not beside him. Across, where he could see her clearly, where there was nothing accidental about her presence. "Do you need to talk through it?" she asked. He looked up then. His eyes had the quality of someone who'd been somewhere else for a long time and was coming back slowly. "I don't know what I need," he said. "That's honest." He pressed the letter flat with one hand. "Marshall's name is Dre, Samuel Dre. He's coming from the territory seat, wants to meet here at the ranch. 3 weeks out." He paused. "Someone gave them new information." He didn't say who. "Do you know who might have?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "There was a man, a ranch hand, worked for a man named Aldous Holt 3 years ago. Name was Prescott. He saw something. I know he saw something because his whole face told me so when I talked to him a week after Clara died, and then 2 days later he packed up and left Harlan's Crossing and nobody's heard from him since." He rubbed the side of his jaw. "If Prescott talked, if he finally talked, then Dre's coming here with enough to make Holt nervous." "Who is Holt?" The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Caleb's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes did. A compression, a gathering. "Aldous Holt owns the largest parcel of land in this county," he said. "He owns the feed supplier, half the water rights on the east side of the valley, and 3 men on the town council." He picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it back down without drinking. "He wanted this land 3 years ago. Clara refused to sell. It was her property, came from her family. Her name was on the deed. I had no legal standing to sell it, and she had no intention of it." His voice stayed even, but it was the evenness of something held carefully in both hands. 2 months after she refused him the 3rd time, she was dead. Evelyn sat with that. "And it was called an accident," she said. "Single shot. They said she must have knocked a rifle from a fence post while she was working in the yard, and it discharged when it hit the ground. He said it the way someone repeats something they've had to listen to until it bored a groove in them. Clara was careful. She was the most careful person I've ever known. Evelyn thought of the handwriting on the back of the photograph, the careful letters. "I believe that," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, a small, involuntary thing, the look of someone who wasn't expecting to be believed and didn't quite know what to do with it. "The land would have gone to her brother if I hadn't bought it from him," Caleb said. "He needed money, and he sold it within a month of her burial. I bought it back." He folded the letter. "Holt hasn't made another offer since, but he hasn't had to. He's been running me out slowly. Water disputes, supply chain problems, two of my best hands leaving without much explanation." He tucked the letter into his coat. "Now this." "He'll know the marshal's coming," Evelyn said. "Word travels." Caleb stood, took his cold coffee to the sink, and poured it out. "Dre's smart enough to know that. He'll move careful." "And Holt?" Caleb turned. "Holt will move careful too. Careful, but fast." He looked at her steadily. "You asked if there was anything you should know about. I'm telling you now. If you plan to stay on this property through this inquiry, what's coming is going to be unpleasant, and some of it may land on you by association. I appreciate you saying so. Does it change your answer? About staying?" She thought about Emmett, east, and looking. She thought about 4 days until the next stage and where the stage would take her, and whether any of those places were measurably better than here. "No," she said. "It doesn't change it." He nodded, reached for his hat from the peg by the door. "I need to ride the east fence line. Should take most of the morning. I'll have something ready at midday." He went. She sat at the kitchen table a moment longer, listening to the sound of him crossing the yard, the horses in the pasture moving, the ordinary sounds of a ranch in the early morning. Then she got up and went back to the garden, because the carrots didn't care about any of it, and right now, that was almost a comfort. The first real trouble in town came on a market day, about 10 days into her third week. Caleb had business at the feed supplier, an ongoing argument about a short delivery from August that hadn't been settled, and he'd asked her to come along because he needed someone to manage the dry goods list while he dealt with the feed office. It was a practical arrangement, and she understood it as such. Harlan's Crossing. On market day was louder than she'd seen it. Wagons lined the main road, townspeople moving between the general store and the dry goods seller, and the butcher who'd set up a block outside. Children running, dogs. The smell of horses and dust, and someone somewhere frying something onion-heavy. She collected what was on the list without difficulty: cornmeal, dried beans, a sack of salt, lamp oil, and was negotiating the price of a bolt of canvas with the dry goods man when she became aware that the conversation around her had shifted quality. Not louder, quieter. The particular quiet that meant people were paying attention to something. She turned. 3 women stood outside the general store. She recognized one of them, Agnes Plum, wife of one of the town council members, a compact woman with a face built for disapproval. Evelyn had seen her twice in town before, and both times Agnes had looked through her the way you look through glass. Agnes wasn't looking through her now. She was looking directly at her, and talking to the women beside her in a voice deliberately just too low to make out. And then all 3 of them looked at Evelyn with the particular expression that women deploy when they've decided something about someone and found it satisfying. Evelyn turned back to the dry goods man and finished negotiating the canvas. She was loading the wagon when Agnes crossed the road. "Mrs. Mercer." She said it like she knew something about it. "Mrs. Plum." Evelyn kept loading. "I wanted to ask, just as a neighbor, you understand, how you're finding it out at the Thorne place." "Fine, thank you." Agnes looked at the wagon. "It's just that people wonder, naturally. A woman alone living out at a ranch with a man who is—" She paused delicately. "Unmarried." "I work there," Evelyn said. "Cook and keep house." "Of course." Agnes's voice had the sweetness of something rotted, just under the surface. "I'm sure that's all it is. It's just that with everything that happened out there, with poor Clara, people feel some concern for the property's reputation." Evelyn set down the sack of salt and turned around fully. "Mrs. Plum," she said, "is there something you need from me specifically? Or are you planning to continue being indirect until one of us runs out of patience?" Agnes blinked. The two women behind her looked at each other. I beg your pardon. I work at the Thorn Ranch. I cook and keep house. I have a room of my own and my own business, which is not available for public discussion. Evelyn kept her voice even, polite, without heat. If you have a genuine concern about anything, I'm happy to address it directly. If not, I have a wagon to finish loading. Agnes straightened. There's no need to be rude. I agree. I wasn't being rude, I was being clear. Evelyn picked up the salt sack and put it in the wagon. Good day, Mrs. Plum. She heard them behind her. The murmur, the indignation, the withdrawal, and she kept her back straight and her hands steady and didn't look around until they were gone. When Caleb came out of the feed office 20 minutes later, she was sitting on the wagon seat, hands folded, waiting. He looked at her. Trouble? Nothing significant, she said. He climbed up. They drove. After a while, he said, Agnes Plum? She looked at him. Was it obvious? She had her company face on when she crossed the road. That usually means she's making someone's day worse. He kept his eyes on the road. She's Holt's wife's cousin. Of course she is. Everything in this valley is connected to everything else, he said. I stopped being surprised by it about 5 years in. Evelyn looked out at the passing scrubland. She called Clara poor Clara. People do. His jaw tightened fractionally. It's how they acknowledge something happened while pretending they don't know what it was. She let that sit. Do people know? She asked. In town. Do they know what really happened to her? The wagon moved over a rough patch, and she held the board beside her. Some of them, Caleb said. The ones who don't want to know are louder. That was a thing she understood. She'd lived inside it, the people who made noise about propriety and reputation while the actual damage went unnamed. She'd sat in rooms full of them. The marshal coming. Will that change it? If Dre's good at his job, yes. Caleb guided the horses around a sharp turn. If Holt's lawyers are better at their job, no. He said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse, like he'd already made peace with the possibility. We'll see. She had her first real conversation with Jose that same week, though it took them getting stuck together in a situation for it to happen, which was probably appropriate. The pump house had a problem. The pipe had split somewhere underground, a fault from the last freeze maybe, or just age catching up, and the kitchen pump was pulling air and rust instead of water. Caleb had ridden out to check the east pasture fence, and Danny had gone home already. And it was Jose who came to the kitchen door in the late afternoon with his hat in his hands and said, in the flat voice of someone delivering news nobody wants, pump's broken. She followed him out to the pump house, and they stood together looking at it. The damp ground around the housing that suggested the break was close to the surface, the discolored water that had backed up into the trough. Can you find where the break is? She asked. Maybe. He looked at the ground, pressed his boot against a soft spot. Probably here. I can help dig. Help. He looked at her sideways. He was 17, she'd gathered, or close to it. A lean young man with his older brother's build and an expression he'd inherited from somewhere that was mostly watchful and a little wary of things until he'd seen enough of them to make a judgment. You don't have to, he said. I know. She looked around for the spades leaning against the pump house wall. The kitchen needs water by morning. Let's find it. They dug for 2 hours. The break was further down than Jose had estimated. 3 feet, which was the kind of thing that happened. And by the time they'd exposed enough of the line to see the split clearly, they were both filthy and the light was going. We can cap it for now, Jose said, examining the break. Proper fix needs a new section of pipe. We'll tell Caleb. For tonight we cap it. There's barrels in the barn. We can carry water to the kitchen. Then that's what we'll do. They worked in companionable quiet for a while after that, capping the line, refilling the disturbed ground, carrying barrel water to the kitchen. Somewhere in the middle of it, Jose said, without preamble, she used to help with things like this. Clara. Evelyn kept working. I got that feeling. She wasn't... People think because she was small she didn't do much. He set a barrel down. She was stronger than she looked. Usually the way. He was quiet again. Then, Caleb's better since you came? Not much, but some. She didn't know what to say to that exactly. I just cook and keep the place up. Yeah. He didn't argue with her, but he didn't agree with her either, which told her he meant what he'd said. He picked up the empty barrel and headed back to the barn, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment before she went back to making supper. She didn't quite know what to do with better. It was a small word for something she hadn't been trying to accomplish. She'd been trying to survive, to buy time, to get her feet under her, to be useful enough that the arrangement continued until she could figure out what came next. She hadn't been trying to be someone's better. But the thing about survival was that it was rarely clean. It didn't stay in its lane. You survived in the middle of other people's lives, and you left marks, whether you meant to or not. She put a pot on the stove and went about making supper. The second piece of trouble came from a direction she should have expected but hadn't been fully braced for. A rider came from the east on a Wednesday, moving fast. She could see the dust from the garden, a plume of it coming up the north road that was thicker and faster moving than a supply rider or a neighbor stopping by. She stood and watched it and felt the cold things settle in her chest before she could think it through. The rider wasn't Emmett. She could see that when he got closer. Too young, too spare, not Emmett's build or horse. He pulled up at the gate and called out, "Looking for a woman named Mercer, Evelyn Mercer." She set down her weeding tool, walked to the fence. "You found her." He was young, early 20s, a hired rider by the look of him, the kind of work-for-wages man who carries messages without caring what's in them. He held out an envelope. "From a Mr. Emmett Mercer. He paid me to deliver it personal." She took the envelope, didn't open it. "Any message back?" the rider asked. "No." He looked uncertain. "He said there might be a message back." "There isn't." She kept her voice neutral. "Safe ride." He lingered another moment, then turned and went. She watched him go down the road until the dust settled, then looked at the envelope in her hand. Her name in Emmett's handwriting. That careful, controlled script that looked like good manners and was nothing of the kind. She'd lived inside that handwriting for 6 years. She knew what it meant. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened it. It was short. Emmett didn't waste words when a few would do. That was something she'd always known about him, a kind of efficiency in his cruelties. "Evelyn, I know where you are. I know who you're with. I am coming to bring you home, and I am bringing enough with me to make clear that this is not a request. You have embarrassed me sufficiently. Come quietly, and it will go easier for everyone. E.M." She read it twice, folded it. She sat in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the ordinary sounds of the ranch, the horses, wind in the eaves. Somewhere, Jose moving something in the barn. Caleb found her there when he came in at midday. He looked at her face and didn't ask if something was wrong, because something clearly was. She slid the letter across the table to him without speaking. He read it, set it down, picked up his coffee and drank some and set that down too. "He's not here yet," he said. "No, but he's close enough to have sent a rider." "How many men does he travel with?" "It depends on what he wants to demonstrate." She folded her hands on the table. "If he wants to make a point, 4 or 5. If he wants to actually take someone somewhere, more." "You're not going," Caleb said. He said it simply, as a statement of position, not a promise or an instruction. "I know I'm not going." She said it with the same simplicity. "But him coming here, I don't want that to land on you. You already have enough bearing down. I've handled difficult men before." "Emmett isn't just difficult." She looked at the letter. "He has money and a legitimate legal claim. A wife who abandoned a marriage. From a court's perspective, he could get papers. Papers take time." Caleb turned the letter over, looked at the address on the back. "And a federal marshal's inquiry in this county takes precedence over private disputes. Dre's due in 2 weeks. You're thinking Emmett coming at the same time as Dre complicates things for Holt. I'm thinking a man like Holt wants things quiet right now. Outside attention on this county, federal attention, is the last thing he wants. Emmett Mercer showing up with hired men and a domestic dispute is noise." He looked at her. "Noise is sometimes useful." She hadn't thought of it that way. She turned it over, testing the edges of it. "Or it gives Holt something to point at. A distraction. Look at the trouble that woman brought to this county." "That's possible too." They sat with the range of possibilities between them. Outside, A horse moved in the pasture. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I'm not asking you to. I mean, even if Emmett comes, I'm not leaving with him. I want to be clear about that because what happens next may be ugly and I don't want you to be in the middle of it expecting me to take the easier path." Caleb looked at her across the table. He had the face of a man who had been told many things over many years and had gotten good at hearing what was underneath them. "I wasn't expecting the easier path," he said. "I've met you." Something moved in her chest that she didn't have a name for and wasn't ready to examine. "I'll write back to him," she said. "Tell him I'm not coming." "You think that'll stop him?" "No. But it's the honest thing to do, and I'd rather he knows I'm not afraid of him than let him think the silence is hesitation." "All right." He stood. "Write your letter. I'll send Danny with it tomorrow." He went back out. She got paper from the desk in the front room and sat back down at the kitchen table, and she wrote Emmett back in her own clean handwriting, 3 sentences. "I received your letter. I am not coming home. Do not send riders again." She signed her name and folded it and set it by the door for morning. Then she went back to the garden because the garden was still there, still growing, still demanding nothing from her except attention and time. She stayed out there until the light went difficult, pulling the last of the encroaching weeds from around the bean row and turning the new bed she'd started. And when she finally came in, her hands were dirty and her bad shoulder ached, and there was a kind of tiredness in her that wasn't unpleasant. Caleb was at the stove. He'd started supper, beans, from the pot she'd left soaking, and he'd added something to them. She couldn't tell what. The lid was on. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. He didn't look up. "You were out there long enough." "I was thinking. Garden's good for that." She came in and washed her hands at the pump. The water came out clear. They'd gotten the pipe fixed properly 2 days prior, with a new section Jose had ridden to town for. "What did you add to the beans?" she asked. "Smoked bone. Had one in the cold room." He lifted the lid, looked at it, put the lid back. "Should stretch it." "That'll be good." She dried her hands. "Thank you." He made a sound that wasn't quite an answer and kept stirring. She set the table. They ate when it was ready, the two of them with Jose's plate wrapped and set outside. The beans were better with the bone, richer, something underneath the simple flavor that made it feel less like subsistence and more like a meal that someone had put thought into. "It's good," she said. "It's beans," he said. But there was something at the corner of his mouth that might have been, in a different man, a small satisfaction. After supper, she washed up while he went out to check the horses before dark. That was the rhythm of their evenings, established without discussion over 3 weeks, the natural sorting of 2 people sharing a space and falling into patterns the way water falls into the lowest available path. She was drying the last pot when she heard him come back in and stop in the doorway. "The gray mare's leg is worse," he said. She turned. His voice was level, but his face had a tightness to it. "I'll ride for the vet tomorrow," she said. "Danny can go." "Danny's going east with my letter. I can ride the other direction." He considered that. "You know the road to Callaway's? Point me at it and I'll find it. It's a long ride for a shoulder that still gives you trouble." "My shoulder's fine." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either, and they both knew she'd go regardless. He gave her the directions to the veterinarian's property. 2 miles south, then west along the creek road, look for the red barn. And she wrote them down on the back of a receipt from the general store because she'd learned not to trust memory when you're navigating unfamiliar country. He went to the front of the house. She heard him settle into the chair on the porch, the familiar creak of it. She finished drying the pot and hung it and stood in the kitchen for a moment. She thought about what Jose had said. "Better since you came, not much, but some." She thought about the way Caleb had started supper without being asked, the smoked bone in the beans, the directions written clearly for a road she didn't know. Small things, nothing dramatic. She'd learned to pay attention to small things. They were usually the real architecture of something, once you got close enough to see how it was built. She rode out the next morning early, before full light, because the vet ran on a working ranch's hours, and she'd rather catch him at the beginning of his day than at the end when he was tired. The bay horse Caleb had saddled for her was steady and sensible, the kind of animal that didn't require management so much as a clear indication of direction. The road south was better than the north road, wider, more traveled, with fence lines marking adjacent properties in long straight runs. She found the creek road easily enough and followed it west into country that was greener than the scrubland around Caleb's place, the cottonwoods thickening where the water ran reliable and the grass coming up better. The red barn was where he'd said it would be. The veterinarian was a man named Otto Calloway, 60s, built like someone who'd spent 5 decades wrangling large animals, and was largely made of tendon and conviction as a result. He listened to her description of the mare's leg with his arms folded and asked 4 precise questions, and then told her he could come out that afternoon. "You're the woman out at Thorne's place," he said, as he was writing the appointment in his ledger. Not accusingly, just checking. "Yes," she said, her drays coming out from the territory seat. "News travels." He blotted the ledger. "I knew Clara. She made my wife a tin bread box about a year before she died. Best made piece we've ever owned." He said it plainly, looking at his ledger rather than at her. "I said at the time that the so-called accident wasn't one. Nobody wanted to hear it from a veterinarian." He closed the ledger. "I'll be out by 2. She wrote back with something turning over in her head. The bread box. The precise description of it. The careful flatness in Calloway's voice when he said nobody wanted to hear it. How many people in this county had sat on what they knew, not from loyalty to Holt or indifference to Clara, but from the simple self-preservation of understanding what happened to people who spoke up? And how many of them were tired of sitting on it? That was a question she hadn't thought to ask until now. She came back into the ranch yard to find Jose at the gate, looking like he'd been watching the road. "Someone came," he said when she'd dismounted. Her stomach dropped. "Who?" "Don't know him. Older man, well-dressed. Caleb's with him on the porch." She tied off the horse and came around to the front of the house. The man on the porch was not Emmett. That was the first thing she registered. Too old, mid-60s, white-haired, with the kind of suit that said money spent on quality rather than display. He was sitting in the second chair, her chair, though she'd never called it that even in her own mind, with a cup of coffee and the bearing of someone entirely comfortable taking up space in other people's places. Caleb was standing at the porch rail with his back to the yard, and when he heard her on the steps, he turned, and she could read his face the way she'd learned to read it over these weeks. Careful, watchful, coiled slightly. "Evelyn," he said, "this is Aldous Holt." The man in the chair turned and looked at her with pale, sharp eyes and a smile that had been deployed so many times it had separated from whatever feeling had originally operated it. "Mrs. Mercer," he said pleasantly, "I've heard a bit about you." She looked at him, felt the full weight of what was sitting on this porch, the man responsible for Clara's death, or who Caleb believed responsible, or who the federal inquiry was coming to examine. Sitting in the second chair with coffee and his easy smile and the comfort of a man who had never once in his life had to wonder whether a room was safe to enter. She looked at him for exactly as long as she wanted to look at him, and then she looked at Caleb. "The vet's coming at 2, she said, "for the gray mare." "All right," Caleb said. She went inside. She moved through the kitchen to the back door and stood outside it for a moment in the narrow strip of shade along the south wall, with her hand flat against the rough wood siding, and breathed. She could hear the murmur of voices on the front porch. Couldn't make out words. The tone of it was the tone of 2 men who had old business between them presenting themselves to each other as if it were new. She'd sat in rooms with Emmett while he talked to men he intended to ruin. She knew what that register sounded like. She pushed off the wall and went back inside to start the midday meal because Calloway was coming at 2 and there were horses that needed tending and a ranch that kept requiring what ranches require regardless of who was sitting on the front porch pretending to be civil. She did not bring Holt coffee. She did not offer. He left 20 minutes later, and when Caleb came inside, his jaw had the set of someone who'd just spent time carrying something heavier than it looked. "What did he want?" she asked. "To remind me," Caleb said, "that he has a great many friends, and that the inquiry is likely to find nothing of significance, and that the whole affair would be easier on everyone if certain people would be reasonable about the land question. He came here to say that. He came here to say it to my face, so I'd know he wasn't afraid of Dre coming." He poured himself coffee. "He's afraid of Dre coming." "I know." She put the lid back on the soup pot. "He wouldn't have come otherwise." Caleb drank his coffee. Outside, the horses moved in the pasture, and somewhere to the south, a hawk was working the thermals over the valley, riding the hot air up and up without a single beat of effort, and the afternoon was building toward its full, unsparing heat. "We have 2 weeks," Caleb said. 2 weeks, she agreed. That was what they had. The letter from the marshal, the letter from Emmett, Holt's visit to the porch, Calloway's breadbox comment, Agnes Plum's carefully calibrated disapproval. All of it gathering the way weather gathers, slowly at first and then all at once, building into something that was going to require more than just getting through the days one at a time. She stirred the soup, the kitchen filled with the smell of it. 2 weeks. She'd survived worse waiting periods with less preparation and fewer people standing anywhere near her side of things. She was going to need that reminder in the days ahead, she suspected. She was going to need to say it to herself the way you press on a bruise, deliberately, to know it's still there, to know you haven't lost track of what you're dealing with. But for right now, there was soup on the stove and a mare that needed a veterinarian and an afternoon of work still ahead of her, and that was enough to keep moving forward on. That would have to be enough. Marshal Samuel Dre arrived on a Tuesday, which somehow felt right, not a Monday, which would have given the week a sense of clean beginning, and not a Wednesday, which sat too comfortably in the middle of things. Tuesday was a day that arrived before you were ready for it, and that seemed appropriate for what he carried with him. He came with one deputy and no advance notice beyond the letter, which Caleb had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold lines. The deputy was young and fair-haired and rode like someone still getting used to the length of his own legs. Dre himself was compact, 50s, with a gray mustache and the unhurried quality of a man who had learned that urgency was usually someone else's problem. He wore a good coat, well brushed, and a badge that caught the morning light as he dismounted in the yard. Evelyn was at the well. She watched him come down from the horse with the deliberate care of a man whose knees had been giving him trouble for a while, and she thought, this is what someone who actually means to do something looks like. Not theatrical, not rushing, just moving toward the work. Caleb came off the porch and they shook hands without ceremony. "Mr. Thorne." "Marshall." A pause. "Coffee inside." "Appreciate it." Evelyn set down the water bucket and came up to the porch, and Caleb said, "Marshal Dre, this is Evelyn Mercer. She manages the house." Dre looked at her with the steady, cataloging attention of someone whose job required him to notice things. Not rude, just thorough. "Mrs. Mercer." "Marshall." She held the door. "Coffee's fresh." They went inside. The deputy, his name was Haskell, it turned out, said with the slightly defensive precision of someone whose name got mangled often, stayed with the horses. Evelyn poured coffee and set out the cornbread she'd made that morning and then moved to go, because this was Caleb's conversation. "You can stay," Dre said, without looking up from the cup he was examining. "If you've been on this property the past month, you may have something useful to say." She sat. Dre pulled a leather document case from inside his coat and set it on the table. He didn't open it immediately. He drank his coffee and looked around the kitchen with the same steady attention he'd given everything else. And then he said, "Mr. Thorne, I'm going to tell you what we have before I ask you anything, because I think that's the honest way to do this, and I've found it saves time." "All right," Caleb said. "The man named Prescott, Elias Prescott, worked for Holt's operation in '79, came forward 8 weeks ago. He's currently in protective custody at the territory seat." Dre opened the document case and turned it toward Caleb without taking anything out of it, just showing the thickness of what was in there. His account of what he witnessed on the day your wife died is detailed and consistent with the physical evidence that was available at the original inquiry, had anyone looked at it correctly. Caleb's hands were flat on the table. What did he see? He saw 2 men from Holt's property on the east ridge above your yard, approximately 1 hour before the incident was reported. He saw them leave quickly after a single shot. He went back to Holt's property, told no one, and 2 days later received a substantial sum of money and a strong suggestion that he might find the climate in another territory more agreeable. Silence in the kitchen. Outside, Haskell was walking the horses in the yard, the sound of hooves on packed dirt, steady and ordinary against the weight of what was being said inside. 3 years, Caleb said. The 2 words sat in the room and took up a great deal of it. He was afraid, Dre said. Not excusing it, just stating it. He still is, but he's more afraid of dying with it on him than of what Holt might do. He picked up his coffee again. Prescott's account names 2 men specifically. Both are still in Holt's employ, and Prescott's account includes a detail that wasn't public knowledge. the specific rifle, a particular make with a distinctive stock. That rifle is in our evidence hold, recovered from a pawn transaction in Colton 18 months ago. Evelyn watched Caleb's face go through something private and complicated and not entirely visible from the outside. She watched him not look away from Dre, not flinch, not do any of the things a person might do when something they've been waiting for 3 years to be confirmed finally gets confirmed in a kitchen over cornbread. "You have enough to move on Holt," Caleb said. "We have enough to build the case," Dre said carefully. "Moving on Aldous Holt in this county requires more than Prescott's testimony. Holt has legal resources that will challenge every element. We need corroborating evidence. We need the rifle traced more completely, and—" He paused. "We need someone in this community willing to speak publicly to what they know." "That's a large thing to ask," Evelyn said. Dre looked at her. "It is, which is why I'm asking it carefully." "Otto Calloway," Caleb said. "He told you something. He told us what he told you, I imagine, that the injury wasn't consistent with the proposed mechanism." Dre set down his cup. "He's willing to submit a written statement. He's not willing to testify in open court. He's got a practice and a family, and he's had a long time to watch what happens to people who go against Holt in public forums." "Who else?" Caleb asked. "There are 2 others who've indicated, carefully, indirectly, that they have knowledge they've been sitting on. I won't name them until I know they'll hold. People make indications, and then they reconsider." Dre straightened his document case. "I'm going to be here 3 days. I'll be conducting interviews. I want to be honest with you, Mr. Thorne. Holt already knows I'm here. He visited you before I arrived." "He did? What did he say?" "That the inquiry would find nothing of significance. That reasonable people would see their way clear on the land question." Dre nodded slowly, like a man checking a calculation. "He's not wrong that it may find nothing actionable if we can't get someone to go on record." He looked at Caleb steadily. "I'm not going to promise you what I can't deliver, but I can tell you that Prescott's testimony is real and it's solid. And if we can get one corroborating witness willing to stand up publicly, Holt's insulation gets very thin." The kitchen was quiet after that for a moment. Then Caleb said, "What do you need from me?" "Access to the property, your own account on record, and—" Dre glanced at the back of the house, in the direction of the locked building behind the barn. "Her studio, if it's still intact." Caleb's expression shifted. "It's locked." "I know. I'm asking." Something moved across Caleb's face, the thing he carried around, the weight she'd seen in him from the first day. He picked up his coffee and held it without drinking. "I'll unlock it," he said. She didn't go into the studio with them. That felt right. It was Caleb's thing to open, Dre's thing to examine, and she had no claim on either. She stayed in the kitchen and put together midday meal and listened to the sounds of the ranch, and thought about Prescott sitting in protective custody at the territory seat, carrying 3 years of guilt like a stone in his pocket that had gotten heavier every day until he couldn't stand the weight of it anymore. She understood that kind of weight. It moved differently than fear. Fear was sharp and immediate and had edges you could feel. Guilt sat low and chronic, like a bad back. Always there, worse some days, not something you could set down because it had become part of how you stood. Haskell came to the kitchen door around noon and asked politely if there was water available. She pointed him to the pump and offered him cornbread, which he accepted with the gratitude of a young man who hadn't eaten since early morning and was trying not to show it. "How long have you worked with Marshal Dre?" she asked while he ate. 2 years, ma'am." He drank his water. "He's the best I've seen at this kind of thing." "What kind is that?" "Cases where the money's on the wrong side." He said it simply, like it was a category of work rather than an indictment. "A lot of men won't touch those. Dre thinks they're the only kind worth touching." She thought about that after Haskell went back outside. Caleb and Dre were in the studio for nearly an hour. She didn't watch the clock exactly, but she marked it the way you mark time when you're conscious of it. The light moving, the sound of things outside, the soup going through its stages on the stove. When they came back past the kitchen window, she could see Caleb's face, and what she saw there was the thing she'd wondered about. Whether opening that lock would bring some kind of relief or just more grief. From what she could read at that distance and through glass, the answer appeared to be both, in about equal measure, which was probably the honest outcome. Dre ate midday meal with them. The soup, the last of the cornbread, coffee after. And then he and Haskell rode out to begin their interviews in town. He was courteous throughout and said nothing further about the investigation, and Caleb was quiet in a way that had a different texture than his usual quiet. After they'd gone, she washed up and he sat at the table not doing anything in particular, which was unusual enough that she noticed. "You all right?" she asked. "I haven't been in there in 3 years," he said. "The studio." "I know." She had a piece she was working on when she died. A decorative panel, tin work, flowers and birds. She'd been at it for weeks. He looked at the table. It was still there, half finished. His voice was level. "I don't know why I expected it to be different. I locked the door. Nothing should have changed. But it was the same, down to the tools where she left them." He rubbed his hands together once, a slow, deliberate gesture. Dre photographed everything, took some of the finished pieces as evidence. The work matched a particular style he'd seen described somewhere. "I don't know what that means for the case." He didn't say. She dried the last bowl and hung the cloth. What Dre said about needing a public witness. "Is there anyone you think would do it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Possibly. There's a woman, Marta Finch, runs the boarding house. She and Clara were close. She told me once, a year after, that she saw something she couldn't explain away, the evening before Clara died. Holt's men on the road near our property. She never told the original inquiry. Why? She has 2 children and no husband. She was afraid." He said it without judgment. "I've never asked her to do anything with it. It felt like something I had no right to ask." Evelyn sat down across from him. "But Dre could ask." "He could." Caleb looked up. "The question is whether she'll say yes." "Is she a brave woman?" He thought about it. "She's a practical one. She'll weigh what she stands to lose against what she stands to gain. Then someone needs to help her see what she gains," Evelyn said. "Not what happens to Holt. What happens to her? To living with it for another 3 years, or 10, or 20. Caleb looked at her steadily. "That would be easier coming from you than from me." She hadn't thought of that. She sat with it. "She doesn't know me," she said. "No. But she'll talk to a woman more readily than to either Dre or me, and you're—" He seemed to search for the word. "You're not asking for anything for yourself. She'll see that." "I'm asking for you, not only for me." He met her eyes. "For Prescott, sitting in a cell trying to do the right thing after doing it wrong for 3 years. For Calloway, who put it in writing but can't stand up in court. For whoever else in this county has been sitting on something and hating themselves for it." He paused. "And for Clara, who was the most careful person I knew and who died from a gun that was anything but accidental." She sat with all of that. Then she said, "Tell me what she looks like. Marta Finch." She rode into Harlan's Crossing the next morning alone. Caleb had offered to come. She'd told him no, and explained why. That a man accompanying her to talk to a woman about courage made the whole thing performative, turned it into an audience. He'd accepted that without argument, which she appreciated. The boarding house sat at the east end of the main road, a 2-story building with window boxes that had geraniums in them, red and determined in the dry heat, the only flowers she'd seen in Harlan's Crossing. That told her something. Marta Finch was behind the front desk when Evelyn came in, a narrow-faced, watchful woman in her 40s with brown hair shot through with gray, and the particular kind of tiredness that comes from running a business alone and making it work regardless. She looked at Evelyn with immediate, accurate recognition. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. "From Thorne's place?" "Yes." Evelyn came to the desk. "I wanted to talk with you, if you have a few minutes. Not about the boarding house." Marta studied her for a moment. Then she came around the desk and said, "Come back to the kitchen." The kitchen was warm and smelled like bread and coffee, and was busy in the organized way of a place that fed multiple people 3 times a day without drama. 2 of Marta's children, a girl of about 12 and a boy a few years younger, were at the back table shelling something into a bowl. They looked up at Evelyn with the frank assessment of children who had learned to pay attention. Marta poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and sat down at the far end of the kitchen table, away from the children. "The marshal came to see me yesterday," she said, before Evelyn could speak. "I know what you're here about." Evelyn sat. I'm not here to pressure you. I know that too. Marta looked at her coffee. What did he tell you? About what I said? Caleb told me you saw something the evening before Clara died. Holt's men on the road. 2 of them. She said it quietly, with her eyes on the cup. I recognized one. A man called Devers. Worked on Holt's east pasture. Coming from the direction of the ridge above Thorne's place. Fast. Like men do when they've been somewhere they weren't supposed to be and are putting distance between themselves and it. She looked up. I was bringing a pot of soup to the Hargrove family. Old woman Hargrove was ill. I went out there twice a week. That's why I was on that road at that hour. You told no one? Not then. Her voice was steady, but her hands around the coffee cup were not quite. My husband had died 9 months before. I had a boarding house with 3 rooms rented, 2 children, and a debt on the building that would have eaten me alive if I'd lost any of those tenants. She looked at Evelyn directly. 2 of my tenants were employed by Aldous Holt. I understand, Evelyn said. I'm not here to tell you what you should have done. Then what are you here to tell me? Evelyn turned the coffee cup in her hands. I left my husband 4 months ago, she said. He'll be here within the week, I think, with enough men behind him to make it clear I don't have a choice. She said it plainly. I've been asking myself since I got Caleb's letter about what I'd do when he arrived, whether I'd stand my ground, and the honest answer is, I don't know yet. Marta looked at her, surprised by the direction this had gone. I'm telling you that because I'm not someone who can come in here and tell you what courage requires. I'm figuring that out myself. She met Marta's eyes. What I can tell you is what you already know, that Prescott is in a cell at the territory seat, and he's scared, and he's alone, and he did the wrong thing for 3 years, and now he's trying to correct it. That Calloway put something in writing, and it cost him something to do it, even though it's a small thing compared to what you have. And that there's a federal marshal here who may not come back if this doesn't go anywhere. And if he doesn't come back, Holt wins. And not just on Clara. On everything. Every person in this county who's been running their affairs around what Holt will tolerate. Marta said nothing. The children, Evelyn said carefully. Your girl. How old is she? 12. She sees how you run this place, what you do to keep it going. She stopped. She also sees everything else you do, or don't do. It was a blunt thing to say. She'd known it was blunt before she said it, and she'd said it anyway, because something in Marta Finch's face said bluntness was what she could receive better than softness. The silence stretched. Then Marta's daughter looked up from her shelling and said, Mama, are they talking about Mr. Thorne? Hush, Marta said, but not sharply. Everyone knows what happened to his wife, the girl said, with the pure, uncomplicated certainty of someone who hasn't yet learned to be careful with knowing things. Old Mrs. Hargrove told me last winter. She said it was a terrible shame and that the wrong people stayed quiet. The kitchen was very still. Marta looked at her daughter for a long moment. The girl went back to shelling without embarrassment, as though she'd said something ordinary. Marta Finch picked up her coffee, set it down, looked at Evelyn. I'll speak to Dre today, she said, before I change my mind. She was halfway back to the ranch when Wade Gurney's wagon cut across the road ahead of her and stopped, blocking it. He had his man with the shotgun, and a third man she hadn't seen before, saw bigger, with the flat expression of hired muscle. 3 of them to her one, on an empty stretch of road between town and the ranch with nobody in either direction as far as she could see. She stopped her horse and sat. Gurney leaned his elbows on his wagon seat. Mrs. Mercer, long ride for a woman alone. She said nothing. Heard the marshal's been asking questions. He picked at something on the wagon board. People get nervous when that happens. Rattle things loose. He looked at her with those watchful, calculating eyes. Word is you've been helping Rattle. Going around town, having conversations. I had coffee with Marta Finch, Evelyn said. See, that's the thing about small towns, he smiled. People notice everything. He shifted on the seat. I'm just here to give you some friendly advice. The situation at the Thorne place, the inquiry, the whole business, that's going to resolve itself one way or another, and it's going to go better for everyone if certain people stay in their lane. Is that a threat? It's advice, like I said. All right. She looked at him steadily. Here's some advice back. Move your wagon. The man with the shotgun shifted it across his lap. Evelyn didn't look at the shotgun. She kept her eyes on Gurney's face. She thought about Emmett, about 6 years of knowing exactly when something was a performance meant to demonstrate control and when it was actually dangerous. She'd learned to read the difference. Gurney wanted to rattle her. He hadn't decided to do anything worse than that. Not yet. Not on an open road with a marshal in the county. "You and Holt are worried," she said. "The marshal being here worries you, but that's not the whole of it." She let that sit. "Marta Finch worries you more, because she's local and people know her, and when a local woman stands up, it means more than a hired hand in protective custody." She watched Gurney's face do something careful. "So you're out here on this road, which is not exactly a subtle move, which means you're more rattled than you want to look." Gurney's expression went flat. The performance dropped off it. "Move," he said to his driver. The wagon moved. She rode past without looking at any of them, keeping her pace even and her back straight, and she didn't let herself breathe fully until she was around the next bend and out of their sight. Then she gave herself 30 seconds, sat on the horse with her hands careful on the reins, and her heart doing what hearts do when the adrenaline peaks and falls and the body starts accounting for itself. 30 seconds. Then she kept riding. Set. She got back to the ranch and found Dre's horse at the post, which meant he'd come back early from his rounds. She went inside and found Dre and Caleb at the kitchen table, and from the quality of the silence when she came in, she understood that something had happened. "Marta Finch came to see me," Dre said, "about an hour ago." Evelyn set down her hat. "I know. You talked to her." "This morning." He looked at her with that cataloging attention. "She's agreed to make a formal statement. What she saw on the road, the evening before Clara Thorne died." He glanced at Caleb. "With Prescott's account, Calloway's written statement, and now this, we have the basis for formal charges." "Against Holt," Caleb said, "specifically. Against the 2 men Prescott identified, and against Holt for directing them." Dre set his hands flat on the table. "This will not be fast. The legal process on something of this magnitude, a man with Holt's resources, in a county where he has sitting relationships with local officials, it will take time. And it will be contested every step of the way." "I know," Caleb said, "and there are risks." Dre looked between the two of them. "I cannot guarantee your safety during the period between charging and trial. I'll have Haskell stationed in the county, but that's one man. Holt's people will know what's happening before I've filed the paperwork, because that's how it works out here." "How long before you file?" Evelyn asked. "I'm riding back to the territory seat tomorrow. I'll file within the week." He paused. "Which brings me to something else." He looked at Evelyn with the same level of attention. "A man named Emmett Mercer has filed papers in Beaufort County requesting a writ of return for an absent spouse. It's a civil matter, not criminal, and ordinarily it would be handled at the county level." His voice was careful, precise. "However, given that I am currently conducting a federal inquiry on this property, any attempted enforcement of that writ while the inquiry is active would be complicated for Mr. Mercer's representatives." Evelyn looked at him. "What I'm telling you," Dre said, without inflection, "is that the timing of this inquiry creates a certain legal environment. Whether Mr. Mercer chooses to send representatives into that environment is his decision. But any responsible legal counsel would advise him that interfering with a federal investigation, even indirectly, even incidentally, is not something the courts look upon favorably. You're telling me he can't come here right now without stepping on your jurisdiction. I'm telling you that if he came here right now with hostile intent towards someone connected to a federal inquiry, his legal position would be substantially complicated." Dre picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. "I thought you should know." Evelyn sat with that. The weight of it, the specific kind of relief it was, not clean, not permanent, but a window, a space in which to breathe and think. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. "Mrs. Mercer, on another matter, entirely your own business, and I mean that, do you have representation? A lawyer?" "No. There's a man in Collier's Ford, name of Biggs, practiced in 3 territories, handles domestic matters. He's not cheap, but he's honest, which is harder to find." Dre stood, picked up his document case. "I mention it because the writ is a real thing, federal jurisdiction or not. It'll outlast my inquiry. You'd be wise to address it." He buttoned his coat. "Mr. Thorne, we'll be in touch as proceedings develop. Don't let anyone on that property you don't know." Caleb walked him out. Evelyn stayed at the table. She sat in the kitchen after they'd gone, after the sound of Dre's horse had moved off down the north road. And she let herself think about all of it at once, which she normally tried not to do. The writ in Beaufort County, Biggs in Collier's Ford, Gurney on the road with his 3 men, Marta Finch and the geraniums in the window boxes. The half-finished tin panel in Clara's locked studio, still waiting, still mid-sentence, exactly where its maker had left it. Caleb came back inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, and then came to the table and sat down, and they were quiet together, which was something they'd gotten better at over the weeks. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence, but presence. 2 people in the same space thinking their separate things without either of them needing to fill it. "Holt's going to move," she said after a while. "Yes. Not legally. Not at first. He'll try the other kind first." She looked at her hands on the table. "Gurney stopped me on the road today." Caleb went still. "And?" She told him. All of it. The wagon across the road, the 3 men, the shotgun positioned for effect, what she'd said back to Gurney, and what Gurney had done after. She told it plainly, without drama, the way you report a thing that happened. When she finished, Caleb's jaw had the set of something held carefully in both hands. "You should have told me immediately," he said. "I'm telling you now." "Evelyn, what would you have done?" she asked. "Ridden out to find them on an empty road? Confronted Gurney in town?" She kept her voice level. It would have given him exactly what he wanted, a reason to escalate. She met his eyes. "I'm not yours to protect. I can report a threat without needing you to respond to it on my behalf." He held her gaze. Something moved in his expression. Not anger, not quite, but something adjacent to it that had more to do with himself than with her. The anger of a man who understands a woman's point and hates the conditions that made the point necessary. "I know that," he said finally. "I know you can." He rubbed the back of his neck. I'd like to know when things happen, that's all." "That's reasonable," she said. "I'll tell you." "Thank you." A pause. "Gurney mentioned Holt," she said. "By implication, he's running messages for him. Always has been. Gurney wants the land. Holt controls the water rights Gurney needs for his north pasture. It's a transaction dressed up as loyalty." Caleb stood, moved to the window, looked out at the yard. The afternoon light was turning, going amber and long. If Dre files charges within the week, Holt's going to spend the 10 days after that deciding how to respond. He'll try to get the charges dismissed at the filing level. That'll buy him maybe 2 weeks. After that, he has to decide what he's actually willing to do, Evelyn said. "Yes." Caleb turned from the window. "And so do we." She understood what he meant. Understood it the way you understand something that's been building for a while and has arrived at the moment when it can't be understood abstractly anymore. The decision he was talking about wasn't the one she'd already made. To stay, to not go with Emmett, to help Marta Finch find her way to Dre's table. Those had been made in pieces, each one at a time, each one smaller than this. This one was different. This was the question of what you were willing to put in the way of something coming toward you, knowing it was coming and knowing it would not be polite about it. "I've been making decisions like that for a long time," she said. "The ones that have consequences." "I know." He sat back down. "I want to know, honestly, whether you're in this, not as a favor to me, not because you don't have anywhere else to go, but because you actually want to see it through." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the afternoon light, with all of it between them. Clara's photograph, the locked studio, Prescott's 3 years of guilt, Marta Finch's geraniums, Dre's careful legal language, Emmett's letter and its careful handwriting. And she said, "Yes." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. "Outside, the evening was coming in the way it always did out here, faster than you expected. The light going sideways and then thin, and then the stars arriving in the east before the west, had finished its colors. The horses moved in the pasture. Somewhere south, a coyote called out, and this time got an answer. She got up and started supper. He stayed at the table, working through something in his own mind. She could see the quality of it in the set of his shoulders, not heavy exactly, more like a man who has finally stopped waiting for something to happen and has accepted that it is happening, which is its own kind of weight, but a different kind. The kitchen filled with the smell of cooking, The lamp on the windowsill caught and steadied. And somewhere out there, between this ranch and the territory seat in Beaufort County, and Collier's Ford and the East Ridge where two men had stood 3 years ago, a chain of things was in motion that would not stop now, regardless of what anyone preferred. She stirred the pot and thought, you don't get to choose when things start. You only get to choose what you do once they have. That had always been enough to keep her moving. She held on to it. Dre had been gone 4 days when the first of Holt's pressure arrived. Not Holt himself, not yet, but the softer kind of pressure that men with money apply before they decide to apply the harder kind. It came in the form of a supply refusal. Caleb rode into Harlan's Crossing on a Thursday to collect a standing order of feed, and came back 2 hours later with an empty wagon and a jaw set so tight Evelyn could see the muscle working in his cheek from the porch. Hennessy's, he said, climbing down. Canceled the account. Said there was a paperwork problem with the previous order, going back 3 months. There wasn't a problem 3 months ago. No. He tied off the horses. There wasn't. He came up to the porch and stopped, looking out at the pasture, at the horses that were going to need feeding. Holt owns 40% of Hennessy's operation. I knew that. I should have been getting feed from elsewhere a year ago. Can you get it from elsewhere now? Collier's Ford has a supplier. It's 30 miles. He rubbed the back of his neck. I can make it work. It's just, it costs more in time and money than Hennessy's did, which is exactly the point. She thought about it. Jose's family, she said. Danny rides from somewhere. Their father runs a small operation south of here. Does he have a relationship with a feed supplier? Caleb looked at her. I don't know. I could ask. It's worth asking. She moved past him toward the kitchen. Come inside. There's coffee, and I need to think through the supply list with you. They spent the next hour at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, going through what was stocked, what was needed in the next 30 days, what could be substituted and what couldn't. It was the kind of problem she was good at, the practical arithmetic of keeping a place running under reduced circumstances. She'd done it inside her own marriage, though the circumstances and the reasons had been different. You're good at this, Caleb said, watching her work through the numbers. 6 years of making things stretch. She didn't say it bitterly, just as information. He was quiet for a moment. He had money. Yes, it didn't go toward the household. She kept writing. It went toward what money goes toward when a man wants to make sure you can't leave, toward the things that made leaving complicated. She looked up. I saved for 3 years before I had enough to actually go. The hem of your dress. She looked at him, surprised. You mentioned it when you got here, he said. The coins. He wasn't looking at her with anything that could be called pity, more like recognition, the look of someone who understands what a thing cost. The hem of my dress, she confirmed. $11.30. She went back to the supply list. Enough to get me here. Barely. The fire in the stove settled. Outside, Danny had arrived for the day and was doing something at the barn with Jose. She could hear them talking, the back and forth of brothers who'd been doing things together long enough to work in shorthand. I've been writing to Biggs, she said. The lawyer in Collier's Ford, the one Dre mentioned. Caleb looked up from the list. He responded yesterday. The writ Emmett filed in Beaufort County. Biggs says it has procedural problems. The filing wasn't done correctly, and because I've crossed territorial lines, Beaufort County's jurisdiction is questionable anyway. She kept her voice steady. He thinks he can have it challenged within 6 weeks. That's good news. It's a start. She set down the pencil. Emmett won't care about the legal writ once he's decided to move. He'll use it as cover, as a way to make what he's doing look official. But it's not actually what's driving him. What's driving him is that I left. She met Caleb's eyes. He can't tolerate that. He never could. When do you think he'll come? I think he's already close. She said it plainly. The rider he sent was from Colton. That's 60 miles east. Emmett doesn't send riders that far ahead without being within a day's ride himself. She paused. I've been expecting him since last week. Caleb absorbed that. You didn't say. I didn't want to borrow trouble before it arrived. She picked the pencil back up. But you should know. I want you to know before it happens, not while it's happening. He was quiet for a moment, then, I've got 2 rifles and a shotgun in the front room, and I'll talk to Jose today about bringing Danny to stay nights for a while. That's sensible. What else do you need? She thought about it. Nothing right now. I just need to know that when he comes, whatever he says, whatever legal language he uses, whatever claims he makes about what I owe him, you won't waver. Not because of him. I've seen men waver in front of Emmett before. He's very good at sounding reasonable. Does he sound reasonable? When he wants something, yes, very. She looked at the supply list again. He'll probably start with that. Emmett Mercer arrived on a Saturday morning, which was somehow typical of him. He had a feeling for the moment that would make the most impact, and a Saturday in ranch country meant people were more likely to be around to witness things. He came with 5 men. She counted from the kitchen window when she heard the horses. 5, plus Emmett, riding in a loose formation up the north road as if arriving at something that already belonged to them. Emmett himself was on his bay gelding, the good one, the one he kept for occasions. He was dressed well. He would be. He always dressed for the version of events he intended to create. She stepped back from the window and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the counter. Then she went to the front room and found Caleb already at the window, watching them come. 6 total, he said. 5 hired. 1, Emmett. She stood beside him. The one on the gray, second from the left. That's likely the man he's calling his legal representative. He always brings one. Lawyer? Something adjacent to it. She watched them come into the yard. He'll want to talk first. Make it seem official. Let him. Caleb looked at her. Let him? The longer he's talking, the longer nothing worse is happening. She met his eyes. I've managed Emmett before. I know the sequence of him. Caleb turned back to the window. Danny and Jose had appeared at the barn door. They'd seen the riders coming and had the good sense to stop what they were doing and be visible without being theatrical about it. Emmett pulled up in the yard and looked at the house the way he looked at things he intended to have. Evelyn? His voice carried well. It always had. I know you're in there. She went to the front door and opened it and stood in the doorway. Not on the porch, not down the steps. In the doorway, with the house behind her. She had thought about where to stand, and this felt right. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And there it was. The thing she dreaded, and also the thing she'd known was coming. Seeing him again, and finding out which was stronger, the fear or the 3 months of distance she'd put between herself and it. He looked the same. Dark-haired, well-built, with the particular handsomeness that had impressed her at 22, and now just looked like a surface. His expression was what she'd expected. Controlled, civil, with something underneath it that was neither. You look well, he said, pleasantly. You've had a long ride, she said. What do you want, Emmett? That's not a very gracious greeting. You're not here as a guest. She kept her voice even, conversational. Say what you came to say. He shifted on the horse, a small, deliberate adjustment, the kind that said he was choosing to be patient. I've come to bring you home. We've had this conversation through letters, and I'd like to have it in person now, which I think is reasonable. It's not a conversation, she said. You're describing a decision you've made on my behalf. That's not the same thing. Evelyn, I'm not coming home. She said it clearly, without anger, the way you say something that's simply true. I told you that in the letter. I'm telling you now. The answer is the same. Emmett's pleasant expression held. She could see the calculation behind it, reading the house, reading the 2 ranch hands at the barn, looking for Caleb. His eyes found the front room window where someone might have been standing a minute ago. Is there someone I should speak to about the situation? He asked. The language of a man who understood that the situation was really about the presence of another man. You can speak to me, she said. I'm the one you came for. Caleb came out then. Not from behind her, but from the side of the house, from the direction of the barn, which meant he'd gone out the back. He came around the porch corner and stood at the rail, and he'd brought nothing with him, no rifle, no visible weapon, just himself in his work clothes and his ordinary stillness. Emmett looked at him. This your place? Emmett asked. It is, Caleb said. Then I appreciate your hospitality. Emmett's voice was still civil, still managing the performance. But what's between me and my wife is a private matter. Then maybe keep it private, Caleb said, instead of riding here with 5 men. A beat. One of the hired men shifted his horse. The one Evelyn had identified as the legal representative opened his coat and produced a folded document. Slowly, making sure the movement was visible and its meaning clear. "Mr. Thorne," the man said. He'd somehow gotten Caleb's name, which meant Emmett had done homework on the way here. "I have a civil writ of return filed in Beaufort County, authorized under territorial domestic statutes. Mrs. Mercer is legally obligated to. That writ has procedural deficiencies and is currently being challenged in Collier's Ford," Evelyn said. She'd been waiting for this part. "My lawyer's name is Biggs. You can contact him directly." The legal representative's face went carefully neutral. "I'm not aware of any challenge." It was filed Thursday. Biggs had moved faster than expected, or she'd asked him to move fast, or both. "The letter's inside. I can get it." She watched Emmett's civil expression do something small and involuntary, a compression, the particular look of a man whose planning has hit an obstacle he didn't account for. It lasted about 2 seconds, and then the civility came back. But she'd seen it. She'd spent 6 years learning to see it. "There's also a federal inquiry currently active on this property," Caleb said. He said it conversationally, like he was explaining something of mild interest. "Marshal Dre's office out of the territory seat. It would be worth considering whether the presence of 6 armed men on this property, given that context, creates complications you'd prefer to avoid." Emmett looked at him steadily. "I don't know anything about any federal inquiry." "Now you do." Caleb held his gaze without aggression, without posturing, just looking at him. "Any action taken against persons connected to an active federal inquiry carries federal consequences. I'd imagine your legal man can explain the specifics." The legal representative had gone quite still. He was doing the math, she could see it, doing it faster than Emmett was, because Emmett was angry, and anger slows calculation. "Emmett," she said. She waited until he looked at her. "Go home." "Evelyn, I'm not coming back, not today, not when the writ challenge is resolved, not ever." She kept her voice steady. She had practiced steadiness for a long time. "I am employed here. I have a lawyer, I have shelter and work, and people who know where I am. There is nothing you can bring here, no document, no number of men, that changes any of that." She looked at him directly, the way she'd learned to do with men who read a dropped gaze as an invitation. "And I need you to hear me clearly when I say this. I'm not afraid of you. I was afraid of you for 6 years. I'm not anymore. And that's not going to change back." Something moved across Emmett's face that she'd never quite seen there before. It wasn't anger she knew. It was something older and more confused than anger, the look of a man who has built an entire architecture around someone's fear of him and has just been told the foundation is gone. He sat on his horse in the morning sun and looked at her, and for a moment the performance dropped completely, and what was underneath it was smaller and uglier and more ordinary than anything his performance suggested. Then he looked at Caleb, then at the barn where Jose and Danny stood watching, then at his legal man, who gave a very small, very controlled shake of his head. "We'll discuss this through proper channels," Emmett said. "To nobody in particular, or to all of them, or to himself." He turned his horse. His men turned with him, the legal man last, and they went back down the north road the way they'd come. And Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched them until they were small against the distance, and then not visible at all. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that when she brought them together in front of her. A fine, controlled tremor, the kind that comes after rather than during, when the body finally processes what the mind was too busy to register. She put her hands in her pockets. Caleb came up the porch steps. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her with the steady attention he brought to things that mattered. "All right?" he asked. "Yes." She thought about it. "I'll be all right in a few minutes." "Take the time." She nodded. She stood in the doorway with her hands in her pockets and her heart doing what it needed to do, and he sat on the porch rail and said nothing and let her have the few minutes she needed, which was exactly the right thing to do. From the barn, she heard Jose say something to Danny, too low to make out, then the sound of them going back to work. The quiet that followed lasted almost 48 hours, which she didn't trust. She'd seen Emmett retreat before. It never meant he was done. It meant he was recalculating, finding another angle, looking for the softer point. She wrote to Biggs the same afternoon, telling him Emmett had appeared in person and describing the exchange precisely, every detail she could remember, including the legal representative's name, Fowler. She'd caught it when Emmett addressed him as they were leaving. Biggs would want to know Fowler, Opposing lawyers always needed to know who they were dealing with. She worked. The ranch kept requiring what ranches require, and she kept providing it. Cooking, the garden, helping Jose with a fence repair on the west side that Caleb had been putting off. Her shoulder gave her trouble with the heavy post-driving, but she found a way to manage it that didn't slow things down too much. And Jose noticed and didn't say anything, which she appreciated. On the second evening after Emmett's visit, she found Caleb at the locked studio again, not unlocking it, just standing outside it in the early dark, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the door the way people look at things they have complicated feelings about. She almost went past without saying anything. Then she stopped. "You could go in," she said. He didn't startle. He'd heard her coming. "I know. Dre has what he needs from it. You don't have to leave it locked for the inquiry anymore." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "It's not about the inquiry." She stood beside him. The evening air was cooling fast, the way it did out here. 30 degrees between mid-afternoon and dark, sometimes, the desert giving back the heat as soon as the sun dropped. "What would it mean to go in?" she asked. He thought about it for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "When I locked it," he said, "I think I was preserving something. Like if I kept it exactly as she left it, it was somehow still her space, still hers." He looked at the door. "But Dre photographed it. Took the pieces he needed. It's evidence now, or part of it. The space has already been used for something she never intended." He stopped. "That sounds ungrateful toward the inquiry." "It doesn't," she said. "It sounds like a true thing." He looked at the padlock on the door. "She would have hated being made into a symbol," he said. "Clara, she was very concrete. She cared about what things actually were, not what they represented." His voice had an affection in it that wasn't soft exactly, more like something worn smooth by being handled often. "She'd have told me to go in and do something useful with the space, probably. Not sit outside it for 3 years being sad." "Probably," Evelyn agreed. "Though being sad for a while first seems fair." "A while," he said. 3 years has passed a while." She didn't argue with that. He put his hand on the padlock, then took it away. "I'm not ready tonight," he said. "But I think soon." "There's no right time." "No." He turned from the door. "How are you?" "About Emmett." The shift caught her slightly off balance, which she suspected was intentional, or at least wasn't accidental. "I'm processing it," she said. "Seeing him was harder than I expected in some ways and easier in others." "Harder how?" "Harder because it's one thing to know you're not afraid of someone, and another thing to stand in front of them and find out if it's true." She looked at the stars starting to come in at the east. "Easier because I saw him clearly. Without all the layers of daily life that used to make it hard to see him for what he actually was." She paused. "He's a smaller thing than I remembered. Not in a good way exactly. Just more ordinary. Ordinary men can still cause damage." "I know. I'm not dismissing him. I'm just saying he's not the enormous thing he used to be in my head." She pulled her coat tighter. "Biggs thinks the RIT challenge will succeed. After that, Emmett's options get significantly more limited. And if he doesn't accept limited, then we deal with what comes." She said it plainly. "But I'd rather deal with what comes than spend my life trying to stay small enough that it doesn't." Caleb looked at her sideways in the darkness. "That's a different woman than the one who fell off the stagecoach outside the general store," he said. "She's the same woman." Evelyn started back toward the house. "She just has her feet under her now." On Wednesday, things broke in 3 directions at once, which was probably inevitable given how much pressure had been building from how many sides. The first thing was the letter from Dre. He'd filed the charges at the territory seat on Monday against the 2 men Prescott had named, 1 count each of murder in the 1st degree, and against Aldous Holt, 1 count of directing the commission of murder. The charges had been accepted. There would be a preliminary hearing in 6 weeks at the territory seat. She read it at the kitchen table and then put it down and sat with it. 6 weeks. A hearing. Prescott's testimony and Calloway's written statement and Marta Finch's account. All of it now in official record, now on paper with Holt's name attached to a charge that couldn't be taken back by a visit to the porch or a canceled feed account. Caleb came in while she was still sitting there. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it, set it on the table, picked up his coffee. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "All right," he said finally. "Quiet. Just that." She understood it. All right wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was something more careful. The acknowledgement that a door had been opened that hadn't been opened before, that the thing he'd been carrying could be set down a fraction, that all right was the closest word to what was happening in his chest, without being dishonest about the fact that it was still a long way from over. "All right," she said back. The second thing came an hour later, in the form of a rider from Harlan's Crossing, with a message from Marta Finch. Evelyn read it while Caleb was out with the horses. Holt was at the boarding house yesterday evening, said nothing direct, bought coffee and sat for an hour, and was pleasant to everyone. That was the message. Wanted me to know he knew where I was and that he was not worried. I want you to know I'm not changing my statement, but I thought you should be aware. M. She folded the letter and held it for a moment. Holt sitting in Marta's boarding house drinking coffee and being pleasant. The deliberate visibility of a man demonstrating that he was not concerned, which was itself a form of intimidation. "I know where you are, and I have no reason to hide." She wrote back immediately. "Thank you for telling me. Dre filed charges Monday. Preliminary hearing in 6 weeks. You did something that mattered." E. The third thing was the hardest. She was coming back from the garden in the late afternoon when she saw the figure sitting on the fence at the edge of the east pasture, and she stopped because the figure was Jose and he wasn't working. He was just sitting there looking at the ground between his boots with the posture of someone who had been given news that required sitting down with. She went to him. "Jose." He looked up. His face had the careful blankness of someone trying to hold something together. "Danny's leaving," he said. "His father got a letter from Holt's man this morning about their south pasture grazing rights. Holt has a claim on the water access. Old agreement. His father didn't know it was still in effect. If Danny keeps working here, Holt will enforce the claim." He looked back at the ground. "His father needs the water. He doesn't have a choice." She sat on the fence beside him. "When?" "End of the week." He was quiet. "It's not Danny's fault." "I know it's not." "He doesn't want to go." Jose turned the fence post under his hand, a slow, restless movement. "He's worked here since he was 15, 3 years. She looked at the pasture, the horses moving in the late light. "This is Holt applying pressure," she said. "After the charges were filed, he can't get to the inquiry directly, so he goes around the edges. I know what it is." Jose's voice was flat, not with anger at her, but with the flatness of something helpless. "Knowing what it is doesn't fix Danny's family's water." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." They sat for a while in the evening air. "I'm not leaving," Jose said. "I want you to know that. Whatever Holt does with my family. I don't have the same situation Danny has. My father has his own deed and his own water, and nothing Holt's written his name on. I'm staying." "I'm glad," she said, and meant it. He looked at her sideways, the same way he had when he'd said better since you came. "You're different than I thought you'd be," he said, "when Caleb brought you here. I thought you'd last a week." "I thought so too," she admitted. He looked almost like he might smile. "You lasted longer than most things." She took that for the compliment it was meant to be, which in Jose's economy of words was probably considerable. She went inside and told Caleb about Danny. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he set down what he was working on and went still for a moment. "I'll talk to Danny's father," he said, "not to change his mind. He's right to protect the water, but to tell him I understand." He paused. "And to tell him that when this is done, when Holt's in a hearing room explaining himself to a federal judge, that claim on the water access is going to look very different." "You believe it'll get that far?" "I think we have to act like it will," he said. "Otherwise we spend the next 6 weeks handing Holt ground he hasn't earned." She nodded. "Callaway," she said. "He knows people. He mentioned a ranchers association last time I saw him. An informal thing, men who've been dealing with Holt's water encroachments for years. I know about the association. I'm not a member. We've had history." He looked at the wall, something private moving across his face. "They thought I should settle with Holt after Clara died, take the money for the land and go." His jaw tightened briefly. I stopped going to meetings. It might be time to go back, she said. He looked at her. They don't have to agree with you about what you should have done 3 years ago, she said. And you don't have to let them off the hook for saying it. But right now there are people in this county who have their own reasons to want Holt's influence reduced. And if they're not standing with you, it's partly because nobody's made the case that this is their fight too. She met his eyes. Dre's charges aren't just about Clara. They're about what Holt does. What he's been doing to everyone in this valley for 20 years. Someone needs to say that plainly. You think I should say it. I think you're the only one with enough standing to say it in a way that lands. She kept her voice even. And I think you know that. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she went to the stove and started the evening meal, and he sat at the table and the fire settled and the light outside went from gold to gray. I'll ride to Calloway's tomorrow, he said finally. See who he can bring. Good. She put water on to boil. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the particular dusty warmth of a house that had been open to the day and was now closing against the evening. Evelyn. His voice made her look up. He was looking at his hands on the table, not at her. When you went to Marta Finch, what you said to her about living with it, not knowing whether you'd stand your ground when the time came. He stopped, started again. That was real. Yes. You knew it would reach her because you meant it. She didn't answer immediately. She turned the thought over. I suppose I did know that, she said. I found that the things that actually land are the things you're also in the middle of figuring out, not the things you've already solved. He looked up at her then. In the lamplight, his face had the quality of someone who has been a long time in the dark and is getting used, cautiously, to something different. I haven't thanked you, he said, for any of it. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. I want to. He held her gaze. You didn't have to do any of what you've done here. You came here to survive, so to get through to somewhere safer. You didn't come here to take on my fight. She thought about that. No, she agreed. I didn't. But you did. It stopped being just your fight, she said. I don't know exactly when, but at some point it stopped. He looked at her steadily. She looked back. This was another kind of quiet than the ones she'd cataloged before. Not the quiet of two people in the same space, not the quiet of something unsaid, but the quiet of something said completely enough that adding more would reduce rather than add to it. She turned back to the stove. Supper in half an hour, she said. All right. She could hear the shift in his voice. Not transformation, nothing so dramatic. Just the small movement of something that has been set down, even partially, even temporarily. I'll get washed up. He went out through the back, and she stood at the stove with the evening wrapping around the house, and the horses moving in the pasture and the north road sitting empty in the dark. And she thought about Emmett riding away from this yard 2 days ago with his legal man and his 5 hired riders, receding into the distance until there was nothing left of him but the dust. She thought about the charges filed in the territory seat with Holt's name on them, sitting in a federal record now, permanent, not to be taken back. She thought about Danny's father with his letter about water rights, and Jose sitting on the fence with his careful blankness, and Marta Finch in her boarding house with geraniums in the window boxes, writing a letter that said, I'm not changing my statement. She thought about all of it the way you think about a thing that has changed its shape while you were busy with the day-to-day of it. You turn around and find it different, find it more than it was, find it has grown beyond what you planted or intended. She'd come here to survive, to get far enough and stay gone enough that Emmett couldn't reach her. That had been the whole ambition of it, enough distance, enough time, enough ground under her feet. But she was in the middle of something now that was larger than distance and time. She was in the middle of people, real ones, flawed ones who made compromises and then lived with them and then sometimes stopped living with them. And she was in the middle of a piece of land with a locked studio in the yard and a gray mare with a bad leg and a weedy garden that had turned out to be salvageable. And she was in the middle of a man who had been a long time in the dark and was learning, cautiously, to look up. The water came to a boil. She put in the grain and turned down the heat and started on the rest of supper, and the lamp burned steady on the windowsill the way it always did. And somewhere out in the scrubland the coyotes were starting their evening conversation, and the frontier sat around the ranch the way it always had. enormous and indifferent and full of weather, and none of it waited for anyone to be ready. It never did. You just went forward anyway. That was the whole of it, really. The Ranchers Association meeting happened on a Friday evening in the back room of Calloway's barn, which had the advantage of being large enough for 12 men and far enough from Harlan's Crossing that nobody could easily report back who had attended. Evelyn didn't go. She hadn't been invited, and she understood that Caleb needed to walk into that room alone, without her beside him, without any suggestion that his position required support to stand up. He rode out at 4 in the afternoon, and she watched him go from the porch, and then she went inside and made supper for herself and Jose and didn't wait up. He came back after 10. She heard the horse in the yard, heard him settle it, heard his boots on the porch steps. She was at the kitchen table with a lamp and a letter from Biggs she'd been reading for the third time, not because it required 3 readings, but because it gave her hands something to do. He came in and sat down, and she poured him coffee without being asked, and he drank half of it before he spoke. 8 men, he said. 8 out of 12 showed up. The other 4 sent word they couldn't come, but that they weren't opposed. He set the cup down. Calloway talked first, about what he'd written for Dre, about the bread box Clara made. His voice moved carefully around that. I think that helped. Put something concrete in the room before I had to say anything. What did you say? That Holt's charges weren't just about what happened to Clara, that the water encroachments, the supply manipulation, the pressure on hired hands, it was all the same thing. One man deciding that this valley was his to arrange. He looked at the lamp flame, that it had gone on long enough, and that we had a chance, with a federal hearing already scheduled, to make the kind of record that doesn't get quietly shelved because Holt has friends on the local bench. How did they take it? Mixed. He was honest about it. 2 of them were angry. Not at Holt, at me, for not settling when Clara died and, in their view, making everything harder for everyone. I let them say it. He paused. Then I said that they were right that it had made things harder, and that I was sorry for the years of difficulty, and that I still wouldn't have done it differently. He picked up his coffee again. After that, the room went somewhere better. She thought about what that would have cost him. The apology, not for what he'd done, but for the weight it had added to other people's lives. Apology without capitulation. That was a harder thing than most people understood. They'll come to the hearing? She asked. 6 of them, as witnesses to the pattern, the water encroachments, the supply manipulation, the grazing claim disputes going back 10 years. He was quiet for a moment. It's not nothing. It's considerable, she said, and meant it. He looked at her across the table. You were right, he said, about going back to them. I didn't want to admit that before I went. You didn't need to admit it before. You just needed to go. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, incomplete, more like the suggestion of one. But she'd learned to read what was small in him and understand its actual size. The preliminary hearing was held 6 weeks later at the territory seat, in a stone courthouse that smelled like old paper and coal dust, and the specific staleness of rooms where important things are decided by people who are tired of deciding them. Evelyn made the 3-day ride with Caleb. Haskell, Dre's deputy, rode with them as a precaution that nobody named aloud but everyone understood. Jose stayed at the ranch with a neighbor's son Calloway had sent over, a reliable 16-year-old named Price, who knew horses and kept his head down. The territory seat was larger than anything Evelyn had been in since she'd left Beaufort County. She'd forgotten the particular density of a real town, the noise, the close buildings, the smell of people living in proximity. She'd forgotten that she used to move through spaces like this as a matter of course, before 6 years of a controlled and narrowing life had contracted her sense of what was normal. She walked through it now and felt the difference in herself. Not comfortable exactly. You don't become comfortable in crowds after the kind of solitude she'd had, but not afraid of it either. Present. Taking up the space she occupied without apologizing for it. Marta Finch was already at the rooming house when they arrived. She'd made the trip alone, which Evelyn thought said everything that needed saying about where Marta Finch had arrived in herself over the past 6 weeks. She looked tired from the road, but her jaw was set in that determined way Evelyn had come to recognize. You made it, Evelyn said. Said I would. Marta set down her bag. How are you holding up? Fine. She meant it. You? Ask me again tomorrow, after I've said it out loud in a room with him sitting there. Holt would be at the hearing. That was how it worked. The defense present, the lawyers present, the judge presiding over what was still at this stage a preliminary proceeding rather than a full trial. But preliminary hearings had a weight of their own. What happened in that courthouse tomorrow would determine whether the charges advanced or collapsed. "You'll hold," Evelyn said. Marta looked at her. You don't know that." "No," she admitted. "But I know you rode 3 days to get here alone, and that's a bigger thing than saying words in a room." Marta was quiet for a moment. "Your husband, did he give up?" Biggs filed the challenge on the writ, and Emmett's lawyer advised him the federal inquiry made enforcement impossible for now. He went back to Beaufort County. She paused. "Biggs thinks he'll try again through civil courts eventually, but that's a different battle for a different time." "Are you afraid of it?" Evelyn thought about it honestly. "I'm cautious about it," she said. "That's not the same thing. Us." The hearing lasted 2 days. She sat in the public gallery and watched Prescott take the stand on the first morning. A thin, gray-faced man in his 40s who kept his hands folded on the rail in front of him and spoke in a voice that was quiet but didn't waver. He described what he'd seen. He described the money he'd been given. He described leaving and the years after, the weight of them. He didn't make excuses. He answered the questions, and when the defense lawyer pressed him hard, trying to find inconsistencies, he said simply, "I saw what I saw, and I should have said so 3 years ago, and I'm saying it now." Calloway's written statement was read into the record. It was precise, technical, and left no room for the proposed accident mechanism to function as described. Marta Finch testified on the second morning. She sat in the same chair Prescott had used, and she looked at the defense table once, directly at Aldous Holt, who sat with his lawyers in his good suit and his careful expression. And then she looked at the judge and told him what she'd seen on that road 3 years ago, and she didn't look at Holt again. Caleb testified last. He was the last witness before closing arguments, and he gave his account the way he did most things, without performance, without dramatizing, just stating what he knew and what he'd observed and what he'd tried to do about it for 3 years. At one point, the defense lawyer suggested that his grief over his wife's death might have colored his interpretation of events. And Caleb said, "My grief is real. The rifle in your evidence hold is also real. I'd ask you not to confuse the two." The judge allowed it. The charges were upheld. All 3 counts advanced to trial. She was standing with Caleb in the corridor outside the courtroom when Dre found them, and she could read the result in his face before he said it. A controlled relief, the look of a man who'd been doing this long enough to know that good outcomes weren't guaranteed and therefore took them seriously when they came. "Trial date in 4 months, Dre said. "Holt's lawyers will push for delay. They usually do. But the charges stand and the evidence is in record, and Prescott is staying in protective custody through the process." He held out his hand to Caleb. "You've waited a long time for this." "Yes," Caleb said. He shook Dre's hand. "Thank you." "Thank Prescott. He's the one who carried the hardest part of it." Dre looked at Evelyn. "And you. Marta Finch wouldn't have come without that conversation." "She made her own choice," Evelyn said. "They always do. Doesn't mean the conversation didn't matter." He tipped his hat. Safe ride back. They rode home slowly. There was no urgency to it. The thing that had been rushing toward them for 6 weeks had passed, and what was on the other side of it was quieter, a different kind of weight. Not lighter exactly, more distributed. On the second evening of the return ride, they camped near a creek stand of cottonwoods, and she sat by the small fire while Caleb tended the horses, and she thought about the hearing room, about Holt's face when the judge said the charges were upheld, the shift in it, the tiny loss of certainty. She thought about Prescott's folded hands and Marta's single direct look at the man she was testifying against. She thought about what it costs to stay quiet about something you know, how the cost accumulates, how it stops being a choice after a while and becomes a condition. The silence, just part of how you live, part of the weather you move through every day, until someone asks you to speak and you realize you've been waiting for that asking without knowing you were. That was what she'd done for Marta Finch, not talked her into courage. She didn't think courage worked that way, couldn't be installed from outside. She'd just asked, just made it clear that the asking was real, that the answer mattered, that there was a place to put the thing Marta had been carrying. Sometimes that was all it took. Not the grand gesture, not the perfect argument, Just someone looking at you and asking in a way that made clear they actually wanted to hear. Caleb came and sat near the fire. He was quiet for a while, which was ordinary. Then he said, "I've been thinking about the studio." She looked over. "I want to do something with it," he said. Not tear it down, not change it into something it wasn't, but open it. Let it be part of the ranch again instead of locked off from it. He looked at the fire. "There's a woman in Collier's Ford who does the same kind of work Clara did. Tin work, decorative pieces." Calloway mentioned her. I thought. He stopped, started again. "I thought maybe someone could work in there, use the tools, make things in the space." He said it carefully, like he was setting down something fragile. Clara would have liked that better than the lock. She'd bust say, "Bum tosum chasset." "I think you're right," Evelyn said. "I think she would have." He looked up at her. "You knew her for about 30 seconds. I knew her handwriting, and the way she organized the kitchen, and what Otto Calloway said about the bread box." She met his eyes. "You can know a person from the marks they leave, especially when the marks are careful." He held her gaze. The fire between them settled into its quieter stage, the big flames gone, the coals doing the real work. "Where are you going to go?" he asked. "After this, when things are more settled." She considered that. "I don't know," she said. "Honestly, I hadn't let myself think that far. It felt like bad luck planning past the immediate problem." "The immediate problem is mostly handled." "Mostly?" She looked at the fire. "Biggs thinks the writ will be fully invalidated by spring. After that, I'm free in the legal sense, free to be anywhere, including here," he said. Careful. Stating something without claiming anything. She looked at him. "I'm not saying it as a condition," he said. "You're employed here as long as you want to be. That was the arrangement, and it stands regardless of anything." He paused. "I'm saying it because I think you should know it's a real option, not a temporary one, not a courtesy one." He looked at the fire. "I'm saying the ranch is better for what you've brought to it, and I'm not only talking about the cooking." She thought about the weedy garden she'd found when she arrived, the carrot row barely surviving under 6 inches of competition. She thought about what it looked like now, a real garden, productive, something you could rely on through the seasons if you tended it. She thought about a locked studio with a half-finished tin panel inside it, mid-sentence, waiting. She thought about a gray mare with a bad leg that Caleb checked every morning because she's not a piece of equipment, said simply, as a fact. She thought about $11.30 sewn into a hem and a stagecoach door that had failed at the worst possible moment, and a man who'd stopped his wagon on a main road in front of a woman he didn't know because someone had put a hand on her arm, and that was simply not something he was going to leave alone. She thought about all the places she'd been trying to get to in those 4 months of moving west, how she'd never had a specific destination, just away, just far enough, just somewhere Emmett can't reach. How she'd never once let herself imagine arriving somewhere and deciding, here, this is it. This is where I stop. It turned out you couldn't plan for here. It arrived before you recognized it, dressed in ordinary clothes, looking like a busted door latch and a dust-covered road, and someone's calm, unsentimental offer of work. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not because I don't have options. Because this is where I want to be." He nodded. Not surprised exactly. More like a man who'd been hoping for something and was being careful about what he did with it now that it had arrived. "All right," he said. That word again, his word for the things that mattered most. She'd learned that about him. That the bigger the thing, the smaller the words he used for it. Restraint as a form of respect. "All right," she said back. The fire burned down. Above the cottonwoods, the stars were doing what they always did. Enormous and indifferent and completely indiscriminate in what they illuminated, the way truth tends to be. It doesn't choose who it lands on. It just lands. Spring came slowly to that part of the frontier, the way it always does. Not arriving so much as accumulating, warmth building in the afternoons, the scrubland showing green along the creek beds, the cottonwoods going soft and pale with new leaves before anyone had quite decided it was time. The trial of Aldous Holt and his 2 men began in March at the territory seat. Evelyn and Caleb made the ride together again, and this time they were not alone. Calloway came, and 4 of the Ranchers Association men, and Marta Finch with her daughter, who had apparently decided she was coming and that was final, which her mother had not argued with. The trial lasted 11 days. Evelyn sat in the gallery through most of it, watching the machinery of formal justice work at its deliberate, imperfect pace. It was not dramatic in the way stories make these things dramatic. It was slow and procedural, and sometimes tedious, with long stretches of legal argument that had no visible emotion in them at all. The defense was skilled. Holt had spent his money well on lawyers, and there were moments where the outcome felt genuinely uncertain. But Prescott held, Marta held. Calloway's technical statement stood up to 3 hours of cross-examination from a lawyer who clearly knew what he was doing. And the rifle with the distinctive stock, traced through the pawn transaction in Colton, back through 2 previous sales, back to Holt's East Pasture operation. That was the piece that didn't move no matter how hard the defense pushed at it. Holt's 2 men were convicted of murder in the first degree. Holt himself was convicted of directing the commission of murder. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in the territorial prison, which was not the same as justice. Justice was a cleaner word than what actually gets delivered in courtrooms. But it was the thing available, the real and actual and imperfect version of accountability, and it was more than Clara had gotten for 3 years. Caleb stood in the corridor afterward with the look of a man who didn't know quite what to do with the ending of something that had defined him for so long. She stood beside him. She didn't put her hand on his arm or say anything consoling, because consoling wasn't what was needed. She just stood there, near enough to be present, giving him room to find out what he felt. After a while he said, "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would." "No," she said. "It wouldn't. I thought I'd feel—" He stopped. "I don't know what I thought. Something cleaner." "The clean version isn't real," she said. "Clara's still gone. 3 years are still gone. Prescott still spent 3 years in the wrong place. None of that gets corrected by a sentence." She looked at him. "But it's real. What happened today is real. And it means something. Not everything, but something." He turned and looked at her. His eyes had the quality of someone standing at a window that has been shut for a long time, in a room that is finally getting air. "She would have liked you," he said. She thought about Clara's kitchen, the handwriting, the bread box Calloway's wife still used every day. "I would have liked her," she said. They rode back. Marta went south with her daughter. Calloway went west. The Ranchers Association men scattered to their separate operations. And Caleb and Evelyn went north, up the road she'd come to know the way you know the lines of a familiar face. Every rock formation, every bend, the cottonwood stand where the creek ran close to the surface, the point where the ranch came into view between 2 low hills. Jose was at the gate. He'd seen them coming, and he was waiting, which was not something he did ordinarily, which told her that he'd been more anxious about the outcome than he'd shown. "Well?" he said. "Convicted," Caleb said. "All 3. Jose nodded slowly, looked at the ground, then back up. "Good," he said, with the flatness of someone for whom the word carries more weight than it sounds like. "Danny," Caleb said. "His father's water access, Holt's claim on it. That was part of the pattern evidence admitted at trial. I spoke to Dre about it. The legal claim is connected to Holt's other property manipulations and will be reviewed." He looked at Jose steadily. "Danny can come back if he wants." Something moved in Jose's face. He didn't say anything. He turned and went back to the barn, and if his eyes were a little brighter than usual, nobody mentioned it. The studio opened in April. Caleb unlocked the door on a Saturday morning, alone first. She gave him that, waited on the porch with coffee until he came back out 10 minutes later looking different in a way she couldn't entirely name. Emptied out, maybe. Or more accurately, like something had been put down and he'd straightened up from the putting down and was figuring out his new posture. "All right," he said, which she understood to mean, "You can come in now if you want." She went in. It was a small space with good north light, the kind of light that doesn't shift much through the day, the kind a craftsperson needs. The tools were on their pegboard, still organized the way Clara had organized them. The unfinished tin panel was on the work table, the flowers and birds half complete, the lines of them clean and precise and full of intention. She stood and looked at it for a long time. "What will you do with it?" she asked. "Leave it," he said. "It's hers. I'll leave it as it is." He looked around the space. "But the tools can be used. I wrote to the woman in Collier's Ford, the one Calloway mentioned. She's interested in having a workspace here during the summer months. Traveling arrangement. That's good. And the panel? He stopped. I thought, if it's ever shown anywhere, at the Ranchers Association gathering or somewhere in town, not a monument. Clara didn't want monuments. As a piece of work that someone made. That should be seen because it's good. She'd accept that version, Evelyn said. I think so. They stood in the studio with the morning light coming through the north window and the tools on their pegboard and the unfinished work on the table. And it was sad in the way that true things are sad. Not crushing, not hopeless, just the weight of what had been, held alongside what still was. There is a particular kind of strength that doesn't look like strength from the outside. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require an audience or a moment of triumph.